She was born into obscurity, in a quiet village far from palaces and battlefields, at a time when France was bleeding itself dry. The 100 Years' War had turned the country into a graveyard of burned towns, empty fields, and broken loyalties. English armies held large parts of northern France, while French nobles fought among themselves, divided by fear, ambition, and betrayal. In this collapsing world, no one was waiting for a saviour, least of all a teenage peasant girl. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village on the edge of contested territory. She could not read or write. She had no noble blood, no military training, and no political connections. What she did have, she claimed, were voices. Voices she believed came from saints sent by God. They spoke to her of France's suffering, of a rightful king uncrowned, and of a mission that would change the fate of a nation. In an age where faith shaped reality, such claims were dangerous, but also powerful. At just 16, Joan did the unthinkable. She left her village and sought an audience with Charles, the Dauphin of France, a weak and uncertain prince who had not yet been crowned king. France was on the brink of collapse. The city of Orléans, a critical stronghold, was under siege by the English. If Orléans fell, the path to southern France would open, and the war would be all but lost. Desperation hung in the air, and desperation opens doors that pride would normally keep shut. Joan was brought before the Dauphin and his advisers, who were torn between ridicule and hope. To test her, Charles disguised himself among courtiers, but Joan walked past the richly dressed nobles and went straight to him. Whether by intuition, chance, or faith, the moment stunned the court. After weeks of questioning by theologians, she was not condemned as a heretic. Instead, against all reason, she was given armour, a banner and command, not of strategy, but of belief. In 1429, Joan rode to Orléans. She did not fight like a traditional commander. She carried a white banner instead of a sword and spoke constantly of God's will, yet her presence electrified the French troops. Soldiers who had known only defeat suddenly believed victory was possible. Joan insisted on direct action, rejecting cautious delays that had defined French leadership. Against expectations, the French attacked. Within days, the English siege, thought to be unbreakable, collapsed. Orléans was freed. The shock was immense. A teenage girl had done what seasoned generals could not. Word spread rapidly across Europe. For the English and their allies, Joan was no longer a curiosity. She was a threat. For the French people, she became something more than human, a sign that God had not abandoned them. Joan pushed forward. She urged Charles to march to Reims, deep in enemy-held territory, where French kings were traditionally crowned. The journey was suicidal by conventional logic. Town after town, however, opened its gates without resistance. Fear preceded her. Armies hesitated. Nobles wavered. In July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan standing nearby, watching the promise she believed she had been sent to fulfill finally take shape. But miracles do not last forever. Once Charles was crowned, the political reality shifted. Joan's usefulness became uncomfortable. She was too independent, too symbolic, too difficult to control. The same court that had once relied on her faith now feared her influence. Support faded quietly. Resources were withheld. Allies hesitated. In 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, Joan was captured, not by the English, but by Burgundian forces allied with them. From that moment, her fate was sealed. The English wanted her destroyed, not as a soldier, but as an idea. Killing her in battle would make her a martyr. Discrediting her as a heretic would erase her meaning. Joan was handed over and placed on trial. The trial was a farce, disguised as law. It was conducted by churchmen loyal to English interests, determined to prove that Joan's voices were demonic, her mission false, and her victories illegitimate. She was isolated, denied proper counsel, threatened, and interrogated relentlessly. Yet even here, the peasant girl astonished her judges. Her answers were sharp, composed, and fearless. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a theological trap, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." Her intelligence terrified them. Unable to break her, the court forced a confession under threat of execution. When Joan briefly recanted to avoid death, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Days later, after resuming men's clothing, likely for protection from abuse, she was declared a relapsed heretic. The sentence was changed, death by fire. On May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, Joan of Arc was burned alive at the age of 19. As the flames rose, witnesses reported that she called out the name of Jesus again and again. When the fire died down, her executioners burned her remains twice more, scattering the ashes into the Seine, leaving no relics, no grave, no place for pilgrimage. They believed they had erased her. They were wrong. Joan's death did not end her story. It completed it. Within 25 years, a retrial ordered by the same King Charles VII, who had once failed to save her, overturned the verdict. She was declared innocent. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. More importantly, she endured in memory as something far more dangerous than an army, a symbol. She terrified kings not because she wielded power, but because she proved that power could be challenged by conviction alone. She showed that legitimacy did not always flow from bloodlines, crowns, or councils, but sometimes from belief so strong it reshaped reality. In a world ruled by men, institutions, and tradition, a teenage girl stood up, spoke with certainty, and changed the course of history. Joan of Arc did not live long enough to see France fully liberated, but she lived long enough to remind the world that history does not always move at the command of kings. Sometimes it moves because one voice refuses to be silent. Even when the fire is lit, close your eyes. Let the glare of the modern world fade away. Take a slow, deep breath and let it out, pushing away the noise of the day until all that remains is the sound of your own heartbeat, steady and calm. We are going back. We are drifting 600 years into the past, to a place where the nights are truly dark, lit only by the moon and the dull orange glow of hearth fires. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves in the valley of the Meuse River in the northeast of France. The year is 1412. The air here is cold and damp, smelling of river mud, wet wool and wood smoke. This is Domremy. It is not a place of importance. It is a village of stone cottages and thatched roofs, huddled together for warmth against the bitter winters of Lorraine. To the west lies the Kingdom of France, loyal to the Dauphin. To the north and east lies the Holy Roman Empire and the lands of Burgundy, allies of England. Domremy sits right on the edge, a tiny island of French loyalty surrounded by hostile tides. The people here know fear intimately. They sleep with one ear open, listening for the thunder of hooves that signals a raid by English or Burgundian soldiers. But tonight it is quiet. It is the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th. In a sturdy stone house next to the village church, a child is born to Jacques d'Arc and his wife, Isabelle Romay. They are farmers, solid and respectable, people of the earth who measure their lives in seasons and harvests. They name the girl Jehanne. Later, history will anglicise her name to Joan and add the title of Arc. But here, In the soft candlelight of the nursery, she is just Johanna, or occasionally Jeanette, when her mother calls her in for supper. She grows up in a world of vivid sensory contrasts. The rough texture of spun wool against her fingers, the heavy tolling of the church bells that vibrate in her chest, and the lush green of the valley floor. Just outside the village stands a magnificent beech tree, ancient and spreading, known to the locals as the arbre de dame, or the ladies' tree. Legend says fairies, the ladies, used to dance beneath its boughs in the old times. The village children weave garlands of wildflowers to hang on its branches, dancing in circles until they are dizzy with laughter. Historians still argue whether this tree was a lingering pagan relic or innocent folklore, but for the prosecutors at Joan's trial years later, it would become a weapon, evidence that her voices were born of ancient superstition rather than divine grace. But young Joan is not thinking of trials. She is a serious child, perhaps a little too serious for hide and seek. She prefers the quiet of the church, kneeling on the cold stone floor while the other children play. She's ordinary in almost every way, except for a certain intensity in her eyes, a way of listening to the silence, as if it were about to speak. She herds cattle in the meadows, learning the patience of animals, because sheep, as it turns out, are excellent listeners but terrible conversationalists. She learns to sew and spin, skills she will later boast are equal to any woman in Rouen. But mostly she learns the geography of fear. She sees the smoke rising from neighbouring villages. She hears the stories of the god dams, the nickname the French have for the cursing English soldiers. She understands that her world is broken. The King of France, Charles VI, is mad, convinced he is made of glass and might shatter if touched. His son, the Dauphin, is disinherited and hiding in the south. The crown is being stolen and the people are suffering. In the heart of a young girl who cannot read a map or wield a sword, a question begins to form, silent and heavy as the winter snow. Who will fix this? She does not yet know the answer is sleeping in her own bed. Time flows differently when you are young, stretching out like a lazy cat in the sun. And the summer of 1425 was particularly long and hot in the Meuse Valley. Joan was now 13, that precarious age where childhood begins to fray at the edges, revealing the confusing shape of adulthood underneath. She was no longer just a child playing by the river. She was a young woman with responsibilities, capable of running a household, tending to the sick, and negotiating the complex social web of village life. But on this particular day, the heavy heat of midday had slowed the world to a standstill. It was noon, the hour when the sun stands directly overhead, erasing shadows and bleaching the colour from the fields. The air was thick with the droning of bees and the scent of warm earth and crushed thyme. Joan was in her father's garden, a small plot of land bordered by a low stone wall and the side of the house. It was a mundane space filled with cabbages, beans and herbs, the practical, unglamorous fuel of peasant life. She may have been weeding, or perhaps she had just paused to wipe the sweat from her forehead, her hand stained with the dark soil of Lorraine. Most teenagers would have been daydreaming about a boy or a festival, or perhaps just complaining internally about the heat, because, let's be honest, 13-year-olds have been masters of the silent complaint for all of human history. But Joan was listening to the church bells. The sexton was ringing the Angelus, a call to prayer that divided the peasant's day into digestible rhythm. As the iron notes dissolved into the humid air, something shifted. The atmosphere in the garden changed. The birdsong seemed to stop, or perhaps it was just that a new sound superseded it. Later, she would struggle to explain it to the judges in their cold stone robes. She would tell them that a light came first a brilliant, dazzling luminosity that did not belong to the sun. It appeared to her right, towards the church, as if the holy building itself had spilled its contents into the vegetable patch. Fear, sharp and cold, spiked in her chest. This was not the gentle fear of a ghost story told by the fire. This was the primal, trembling terror of the finite encountering the infinite. And then the voice came. It was not a thought inside her head, nor a whisper on the wind. It was a voice as real as her father's, but resonating with an authority that made the stones of the garden wall seem fragile. Johanna, it said, just her name. But in that naming, everything changed. She saw a figure within the light, a presence she would later identify as Saint Michael the Archangel. He was not alone. She sensed the presence of angels around him, so many that she wept when they left, because she wanted them to take her with them. But for now, it was the Archangel, the commander of the armies of heaven, the patron saint of the French royal house. It is a detail of profound historical irony that the guardian of the French crown would manifest not in a palace to a prince, but in a cabbage patch to a girl with dirt under her fingernails. The choice seems almost like a divine prank, or perhaps a severe critique of the nobility's incompetence. St. Michael spoke gently at first, knowing that a terrified child is of no use to a grand design. He told her to be a good girl. He told her to go to church often. It was simple, parental advice, the kind a grandfather might give, and perhaps Joan breathed a sigh of relief. Being a good girl, she could do that. She was already doing that. But the messages did not stop there. Over time, weeks, months, perhaps years, the voices returned. Saint Michael was joined by Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, two early Christian martyrs who were incredibly popular in the Middle Ages. They appeared to her as beautiful, crowned figures, their voices sweet and soft. They became her secret companions, her counsel, as she would later call them. While other girls her age were learning to dance or preparing for marriage, Joan was holding summits with the court of heaven in the shadow of the fruit trees. The content of the messages began to darken, shifting from personal piety to political urgency. They began to speak of the great pity in the kingdom of France. They told her that she, Jehanne, the daughter of a farmer, must go to France. In the medieval mind, France was not just the country she lived in. Domremy was on the border, and France referred specifically to the lands loyal to the king, a distant and perilous destination. The voices became specific, terrifyingly so. They told her she must aid the king. They told her she would relieve the siege of Orleans. Imagine the absurdity of it. It would be like telling a modern teenager working a summer job at a grocery store that they must immediately fly to the capital, take command of the military, and resolve a global geopolitical crisis. Joan's reaction was deeply human. She resisted. She argued with the angels. "I am a poor girl," she told them, likely with a tremor in her voice. "I do not know how to ride or fight." It was a valid point. Riding a war horse required years of training, and the only thing she had ever fought was a stubborn cow. But the voices were relentless. They did not offer her a map or a sword. They offered her a mandate. It is God who commands it, they insisted. Historians and psychiatrists have spent centuries diagnosing Joan from across the gulf of time. Was it schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, bovine tuberculosis affecting the brain? Or was it a genuine mystical experience, a tapping into the collective unconscious of a desperate nation? The debate is fascinating, but in the quiet of the garden, the diagnosis did not matter. To Joan, the voices were as real as the hoe in her hand. They were objective reality. This is the crucial key to understanding her. She did not believe she could do these things. She believed she had to. The distinction is what turns a dreamer into a force of nature. For 3 or 4 years she kept this secret. Imagine the isolation of carrying such a fire inside you while you sweep the floor or bake bread. She watched her friends get married, she watched the seasons turn, and all the while the voices pressed on her, louder and more urgent. The war was getting closer. In 1428, English allies raided the area around Domremy. The villagers, including Joan's family, were forced to flee to a nearby fortress for safety. When they returned, they found the church burned and the fields destroyed. The great pity was no longer a rumour, it was smoke in her lungs. The time for being a good girl in the garden was over. The voices changed their tone. They stopped asking and started commanding. "Go," they said. "Go, daughter of God, go." And so, the girl who had never travelled more than a few miles from her birthplace looked at the garden walls that had protected her all her life and realised they were no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. She had to leave. She had to tell her parents, or, more accurately, she had to deceive them, for her father had once dreamt. She ran off with soldiers and told her brothers to drown her if she ever tried. Soft, warm humour is hard to find in a death threat from one's own father, but it certainly clarifies the stakes. She needed an excuse, a way out, and she needed a believer. Not an angel this time, but a human being who could give her a horse. Her eyes turned toward the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where a crusty, cynical garrison commander named Robert de Baudricourt held command. He was a man of iron and appetites, the exact opposite of a saint. He would be her first test. If she could convince him, she could convince a king. If not, she would just be another crazy girl sent back to her father's garden to wait for the end of the world. Joan brushed the dirt from her skirt, stood up, and walked out of the garden, leaving her childhood behind among the cabbages. To understand why a teenage girl hearing voices in a garden was not just a curiosity, but a geopolitical necessity, we must lift our eyes from the cabbage patch and drift upward. Imagine floating high above the landscape of 15th century France. Below us, the country does not look like the unified hexagon found on modern maps. It looks like a shattered stained glass window, the pieces held together only by the leaden weight of war. The land is scarred. From the English Channel in the north down to the Loire River, the earth is marked by black streaks, the charred footprints of armies that have marched back and forth for nearly 100 years. This is the 100 Years' War, a conflict so long that by the time Joan is born, no one alive can remember a time of true peace. Grandfathers tell stories of the war to grandsons who will die in it. It has become a permanent season, as inevitable as winter. But the tragedy of France is not just that it is fighting England. If it were a simple matter of invasion, perhaps the French would have united long ago. The tragedy is that France is fighting itself. The kingdom is tearing apart from the inside, a victim of a civil war born from a single tragic seed, the madness of a king. King Charles VI, the ruler of France, is a figure of profound sorrow. He is known as Charles the Beloved, but also as Charles the Mad. In his youth, he was promising, handsome, athletic, eager to rule. But a shadow fell over his mind. Now, he spends his days in the royal residences, lost in a fog of delirium. There are days he does not know his own name. There are days he does not recognise his wife or children. Most famously, and most heartbreakingly, he suffers from a glass delusion. He believes he is made entirely of fragile glass. He inserts iron rods into his clothes to prevent himself from shattering if someone bumps into him. He refuses to be touched. The King of France, the embodiment of the state, is quite literally terrified that he will break into pieces. It is a perfect, terrible metaphor for his kingdom. Because the king is fragile, the wolves have gathered. Two rival factions of nobles, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, have stepped into the power vacuum, fighting for control of the Mad King's person and authority. On one side are the Burgundians, led by the powerful Dukes of Burgundy. They control the north and east, including Paris. They are wealthy, organised, and out of hatred for their rivals, they have done the unthinkable. They have allied themselves with the English. On the other side are the Armagnacs, a faction loyal to the king's son, the Dauphin Charles. They control the south. They are generally seen as the French party, but they are disorganised, broke, and demoralised. Between these two grinding stones, the common people are crushed. Soldiers from both sides pillage the countryside, taking what they want: grain, livestock, winter coats, and burning what they cannot carry. There is no police force, no justice system, only the rule of the sword. A peasant in 1420 does not care much about the colour of the banner flying over the castle. He only cares that the men riding under it do not set fire to his barn. But then the final blow falls. In 1420, just 9 years before Joan leaves her garden, the unthinkable becomes law. The Queen of France, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman history has judged perhaps too harshly, or perhaps not harshly enough, signs the Treaty of Troyes. It is a document of surrender that reads like a death warrant for the French identity. In this treaty, the Mad King Charles VI disinherits his own son, the Dauphin. He declares that upon his death, the crown of France will not go to his flesh and blood, but to Henry V, the warrior king of England, who will marry the French king's daughter. It is a diplomatic masterstroke for the English. With a stroke of a quill, France is effectively cancelled. The Dauphin Charles is declared illegitimate, a bastard banished to the south, stripped of his rights and his future. When Henry V and Charles VI both die in 1422, the crown passes to Henry's infant son, sitting in London. So, technically, as Joan listens to her voices, the King of France is a baby in England. The Dauphin Charles, now a young man in his 20s, is left clinging to a shrinking scrap of territory south of the Loire. He is a king without a crown, a prince without a treasury, and a leader without a spine. He holds court in the city of Bourges, earning him the mocking nickname, the King of Bourges. He is paralysed by doubt. Is he truly the king? Is he legitimate? Or is his mother right? And is he the product of a scandalous affair, unworthy of the throne? Depression hangs over the court of Bourges like damp velvet. The treasury is so empty that the Dauphin reportedly has to sell his jewellery to pay for his dinner. His shoemaker refuses to deliver new boots until the old ones are paid for. It is almost funny, in a bleak way. The heir to Charlemagne arguing over a cobbler's bill while his kingdom burns. But while the nobles bicker over debts and titles, the English war machine is moving again. The English regent, the Duke of Bedford, is a competent, cold administrator who intends to finish the job. He looks south. He sees the River Loire as the final barrier. If the English can cross the Loire, they can sweep into the south, crush the last resistance, and unite the two kingdoms forever. The key to the Loire is the city of Orléans. It is a heavily fortified city, a tough nut to crack, but if Orléans falls, the dominoes will tumble all the way to the Mediterranean. The siege is tightening. The noose is closing. This is the world that waits for Joan. It is not a fairy tale kingdom of shining knights and dragons. It is a muddy, bloody, bankrupt mess. It is a world where the adults have failed completely. The knights have lost the battles at Agincourt and Verneuil. The politicians have signed away the country. The church is divided by the Great Schism, with rival popes fighting for power. Every traditional pillar of authority, crown, sword, and altar, is cracked. Logic dictates that France is finished. A betting man in 1428 would put every gold écu he had on an English victory. There is no rational path to a French revival. The armies are too weak, the morale too low, the leadership too fractured. And this is exactly why the solution had to come from outside of rationality. It could not come from a general, because the generals were beaten. It could not come from a priest, because the church was compromised. It could not come from a noble, because the nobles were treacherous. It had to come from nowhere. It had to be irrational. It had to be impossible. If you were writing this story as fiction, an editor would tell you it is too implausible. They would say you cannot send a teenage girl to save a kingdom that has chewed up the greatest warriors of the age. They would say the contrast is too sharp. The illiterate versus the learned, the virgin versus the veterans, the peasant versus the princes. But history, fortunately, does not have an editor. It only has the raw, chaotic momentum of events colliding with the human spirit. So, while the Dauphin sulks in his unpaid shoes, and the English cannons pound the walls of Orléans, the camera of history pans back to the northeast, to the village of Domremy. The girl is packing a small bundle. She's putting on a red dress, a poor choice for stealth, but she has a flair for the dramatic, even now. She is preparing to tell her parents she is going to help her cousin's wife with childbirth, a lie that tastes like ash in her mouth. She's walking toward the edge of the known world, armed with nothing but a ring given to her by her parents, and the absolute terrifying conviction that she is the only person on earth who can do what needs to be done. The Mad King broke the world with glass. The peasant girl intends to fix it with fire. The distance between Domremy and Vaucouleurs is only about 12 miles, a morning's walk for a healthy country girl, yet in 1428 crossing that distance meant stepping from the edge of the known world into the centre of the storm. Joan did not go alone. She enlisted the help of a relative, Durand-Lassois, a man whom history remembers fondly as the first person to simply say yes to her. She called him uncle, though he was a cousin by marriage, and one can only imagine the conversation on the road, the teenage girl speaking of armies and coronations, the older man perhaps nodding slowly, caught between skepticism and the infectious gravity of her conviction. They arrived in Vaucouleurs, a fortified town perched on a hill, bristling with stone walls and suspicion. This was the command of Robert de Baudricourt, a captain who was the very definition of a hard case. He was a professional soldier, a man of appetites and armour, who had spent his life navigating the treacherous politics of the frontier. He dealt in steel, coin, and supply lines, not visions. When Joan walked into his hall, likely smelling of the road, wearing her red peasant dress, and looking utterly out of place among the guards, Baudricourt did not see a saviour. He saw a nuisance. The encounter went exactly as you might expect. Joan stood before him and delivered her impossible message, that she had been sent by the King of Heaven to take the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned. Baudricourt looked at her, then at her uncle, and let out a laugh that likely echoed off the cold stone walls. His response was brutal and practical. He told Lassois, "Take her home to her father and give her a good thrashing." In his world, hysteria was cured with a switch, not a siege. It was a rejection that would have crushed most dreamers. A no from a man like Baudricourt was final. It was the voice of authority, of experience, of the real world telling the dream world to go away. But Joan did not go home. This is where the story shifts from a tale of voices to a tale of iron will. She returned to the village for a time, but the voices would not let her rest, and by January 1429 she was back in Vaucouleurs. This time she refused to be dismissed. She took up residence in the house of a wheelwright and his wife, living quietly in the town. She became a fixture in the local chapel, kneeling for hours in the damp cold, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. And a strange thing began to happen. The town of Vaucouleurs, hardened by war and cynicism, began to fall under her spell. It wasn't that she performed magic tricks. It was her absolute, terrifying sincerity. In a world of shifting allegiances and lies, her clarity was magnetic. Two men in particular, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, soldiers of minor nobility who served the garrison, found themselves drawn to her. Jean de Metz, a man who had likely seen enough death to stop believing in anything, later recalled asking her, "Must the king be driven from the kingdom, and are we to be English?" Joan's answer was soft but devastatingly clear. She told him that no one in the world, not kings, nor dukes, nor the daughter of the King of Scotland, could recover the kingdom of France. "There is no help but in me," she said. It sounded arrogant, yet she added, "Although I would rather have remained spinning at my mother's side. But I must go, and I must do this thing, because my Lord wills it." When he asked who her Lord was, she simply said, "God." Something in her voice cracked the soldier's armour. He pledged his faith to her, hand in hand, a moment of feudal loyalty offered not to a lord, but to a peasant. The people of Vaucouleurs began to whisper about an old prophecy attributed to Merlin or perhaps Marie d'Avignon, which said that France would be ruined by a woman and saved by a virgin from the borders of Lorraine. The woman who ruined it was easy to identify, Queen Isabeau, who had signed the treaty disinheriting her son. The virgin? Well, she was standing right there, attending morning mass. Baudricourt, however, remained a wall. He needed proof, and so, on a cold day in February, Joan walked into his chaotic audience chamber and told him something impossible. She claimed that on that very day, the Dauphin's forces had suffered a terrible defeat near Orléans. She couldn't possibly know this. The battle was hundreds of miles away, and news travelled at the speed of a horse. Baudricourt hesitated. If she was wrong, she was a lunatic. If she was right, well, that was a more frightening possibility. Days later, a messenger arrived from the front. The news was grim. The French had indeed suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of the Rouvray, also known as the Battle of the Herrings, so named because the English supply wagons were carrying barrels of fish for Lent. The timing matched Joan's declaration perfectly. The skepticism of the old soldier finally shattered. He could fight armies, but he could not fight a girl who saw across the horizon. On roughly February 13th, 1429, Baudricourt granted her permission to leave. He gave her a sword and an escort of 6 men, including the loyal Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. But before she could leave, a transformation was required. The journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin was hiding, would take them through hundreds of miles of enemy territory. A girl in a red dress would be a beacon for bandits and English patrols. It was for safety, not style, that Joan made the decision that would later become the central obsession of her trial. She cut her hair short, en écuelle, like a bowl cut, fashion historians note, with a touch of amusement, and donned men's clothing. The people of Vaucouleurs, now fully invested in their local saint, pooled their money to buy her a tunic, hose, boots, and spurs. When she stepped out of the wheelwright's house, she was no longer Jehanne the shepherdess. She was something entirely new. She looked like a page boy, slight and small. But when she swung herself into the saddle of the horse Baudricourt provided, she did not ride like a sack of flour. She rode, observers noted with surprise, like a man who had spent his life on horseback. The voices had not taught her that. Perhaps she had practiced on her father's farm horses in secret, or perhaps, as the soldiers began to whisper, the angels were holding the reins. As she prepared to ride out, Robert de Baudricourt, the man who had wanted to beat her, stood at the gate. He did not offer a prayer, he did not offer money. He simply looked at the girl who had worn him down with the relentless friction of her faith, shrugged his heavy shoulders, and spoke the words that launched the legend. "Va," he said. his voice rough with resignation. Va et advienne que pourra. Go, and let come what may. It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was enough. The gate creaked open, revealing the dark, frozen road ahead. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Joan turned her horse south, leaving the only world she had ever known, riding toward a king she had never met, to save a country that had already given up. The gate of Vaucouleurs clicked shut behind them, a sound like a lock turning on the entire world, and the small party was swallowed by the immense, suffocating silence of the winter night. 11 days lay ahead of them, 11 days of riding through the very heart of enemy territory, a gauntlet of frozen rivers, dark forests, and patrolling Burgundian soldiers who would have happily cut their throats for the coin in their purses. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon was roughly 350 miles, a distance that a modern car could cover in an afternoon. But in the fractured, lawless landscape of 1429, it was an odyssey across a sea of hostility. They moved under the cover of darkness, ghosts drifting through a kingdom that wanted them dead. The party consisted of Joan, the two squires Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, a royal messenger, and two servants. They had wrapped the hooves of their horses with cloth to muffle the sound of their passage on the hard-packed frost, a detail that transforms the history into something tactile, the dull thud, thud, thud of the cavalcade, replacing the sharp clatter of iron on stone. For Joan, this was the first true test of her physical endurance. She had traded her peasant skirt for a tunic and hose, her wooden clogs for heavy leather boots, and the slow rhythm of the herd for the jarring, bone-rattling pace of a warhorse. Riding is a deceptive art. It looks like sitting, but after 10 hours in a medieval saddle, the body feels as though it has been put through a millstone. Yet the soldiers noticed something unsettling. She did not complain. While the men grumbled about the cold, the saddle sores, and the lack of hot food, the girl rode with a spine of steel, her eyes scanning the tree line, her focus absolute. It was the first glimpse of the indefatigable quality that would later baffle veteran generals. She seemed fueled by a source of energy that bypassed the need for comfort entirely. They avoided the main roads, threading their way through the tangled woodlands of Champagne and Burgundy. Every bridge was a potential trap. Every village was a danger zone. When they had to cross a river, the Marne, the Aube, the Yonne, they did so at obscure fords, plunging into the black icy water that swirled around the horses' bellies, the cold biting through their leather boots like teeth. It is easy to romanticize this journey as a holy procession, but in reality it was a tactical evasion played out in high tension. The soldiers, Jean and Bertrand, were in a constant state of anxiety, not just because of the English patrols, but because of the passenger they were protecting. They were seasoned men, accustomed to the rough camaraderie of camps, and suddenly they were guarding a virgin who claimed to speak to angels. It unnerved them. Jean de Metz later confessed that for the first few nights he slept fully armoured next to her, his hand resting on his sword hilt, watching her breathe in the moonlight. He admitted to wondering, in the deepest part of the night, if she was a witch. Was she casting a spell on them? Was she leading them into a trap? But as the nights wore on, his fear dissolved into awe. He watched her sleep, innocent, exhausted, and utterly at peace, and realized that the only thing supernatural about her was her lack of fear. She did not act like a witch. She acted like a younger sister who happened to be on a deadline from God. The only conflict arose from her piety. Joan, fresh from the altar, wanted to stop at every church they passed to hear Mass. The soldiers, practical men, who preferred their heads attached to their necks, had to refuse. If we go into that town, they likely whispered, gesturing to a distant spire. The Burgundians will spot us, and we will be dead before the Kyrie. Joan would sigh, frustrated by the earthly logistics of staying alive, but she obeyed. Instead, she prayed in the saddle, her breath pluming in the cold air, turning the rhythmic gait of the horse into a kind of mobile liturgy. It is a strange image to hold in your mind. A girl dressed as a boy, armed with a sword she had never used, whispering prayers to the rhythm of hooves while 6 armed men jumped at the snap of every twig. Historians still debate the exact route they took, tracing lines on maps that try to make sense of how they slipped through the net. Some argue they used secret safe houses. Others suggest they simply moved too fast for news to catch them. The most likely truth is that they were aided by the arrogance of their enemies. The English and Burgundians were looking for armies, for spies, for noblemen carrying gold. They were not looking for a teenage girl and a handful of tired escorts. They were invisible because they were impossible. As they crossed the river Loire and entered the territory loyal to the Dauphin, the landscape began to soften. The sharp, jagged hills of the east gave way to the rolling, fertile valleys of Touraine, known as the Garden of France. The air grew slightly warmer, the grip of winter loosening just enough to smell the damp earth of approaching spring. But the danger had shifted from physical capture to political rejection. They were safe from English swords, but now they faced the weapon of skepticism. Joan sent a letter ahead to the king, dictating it to a scribe in a town along the way. It was bold, bordering on insolent. She told the king she had travelled 150 leagues to help him, and that she would know him amongst all his courtiers. It was a promise of recognition, a mystical credential offered in advance. On roughly March 4th or 5th, the small band of travellers crested a hill and saw it, the Château de Chinon. It rose from a ridge overlooking the Vienne River, a massive sprawl of towers and ramparts, grey stone turning violet in the twilight. To the soldiers, it was a fortress. To the Dauphin hiding inside, it was a sanctuary. To Joan, it was the destination the voices had whispered of in the garden so long ago. She had done it. She had walked out of the fairy tale and onto the stage of history. They rode down the final stretch of road, the horses sensing the end of the journey, picking up their pace. The town of Chinon was bustling, filled with the displaced court, refugees and soldiers. As Joan rode through the narrow streets, heads turned. Who was this slight figure in travel-stained grey tunic, riding with the confidence of a knight? She did not look like a saviour. She looked like a tired boy who had ridden too far. She was lodged in an inn near the castle, waiting for the king's summons. For 2 days, the court debated. Should they let her in? Was she a madwoman? A spy? A gift from God? The advisers argued, the bishops fretted, and the Dauphin wavered, true to his nature. But finally, curiosity, or perhaps the sheer lack of any other option, won out. The summons came. Joan washed the dust of the road from her face, but she kept her men's clothes. She would not meet the king as a peasant girl in a red dress. She would meet him as a soldier of heaven. She stepped out into the cool evening air, looking up at the looming towers of the castle where the torches were already being lit, unaware that the test awaiting her in the great hall would be far more difficult than the 11 days of cold and fear she had just survived. The ride was over. The dance was about to begin. The ascent to the great hall of the Château de Chinon was a physical climb that mirrored the social one. The fortress loomed high on a rocky spur, forcing anyone approaching it to look upward and feel small. On the evening of Joan's audience, the castle was not sleeping. It was a hive of nervous energy, ablaze with torchlight that spilled from the narrow windows and danced on the dark waters of the Vienne below. Inside the great hall, a cavernous space 50 feet wide and 100 feet long. The air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of roasting meat, unwashed bodies masked by heavy perfumes, damp stone, and the sharp, resinous smoke of 100 torches. More than 300 knights, nobles, and courtiers were packed into the room, a glittering, murmuring sea of velvet and steel. They were there for the spectacle. The rumour had spread that a prophetess from the borders was coming, and in a court bored by defeat and bankruptcy, any diversion was welcome. But this was not just a reception, it was a trap. The Dauphin Charles, whose personality was a complex knot of anxiety, piety, and suspicion, had decided to test the girl. He was a man who lived his life in the subjunctive mood, always wondering what might happen, rarely deciding what should. He was 26 years old, but he carried the weight of a doomed dynasty on shoulders that were physically slight. He was not a warrior king like his rival Henry IV. He was quiet, physically unprepossessing, with sad, heavy-lidded eyes and a nose that his detractors found easy to caricature. He terrified easily. He doubted constantly. And tonight, he decided to hide. He stripped off his royal robes and dressed in the simpler clothes of a minor courtier, mingling into the crowded back of the room. In his place, on the throne, or standing prominently near the fire, he placed a decoy, likely a cousin or a high-ranking noble dressed in the resplendent finery of the monarch. The logic was simple. If this girl was truly sent by God, she would know the true king by divine instinct. If she was a fraud, she would bow to the fancy hat. It was a parlour game with the fate of a nation at stake. The heavy oak doors groaned open. The murmur of the crowd died instantly, replaced by the shuffling of feet and the crackle of the fire. Joan stepped across the threshold. She was still dressed in her travelling clothes, the black and grey tunic of a male squire, her hair cropped short. She looked impossibly small in the vast, high-ceilinged hall, a sparrow entering an eagle's nest. She did not look down. She did not hesitate. Witnesses later recalled the strange gravity she carried, a bubble of silence that moved with her. She walked into the gauntlet of staring eyes, the courtiers parting like water before her. She approached the decoy, the man preening in the royal spotlight. The room held its breath. A fraud would have knelt immediately, eager to please the man in the gold brocade. Joan walked right past him. She didn't even pause. It was a moment of social awkwardness so profound it probably made several dukes cringe. Ignoring a man dressed as a king is generally considered bad manners, if not treason. She scanned the crowd, her eyes moving over the sea of faces, searching not for a crown, but for a soul. She found him. Hiding in a nook near the crowd, perhaps trying to look invisible, was Charles. Joan turned and walked straight to him. She knelt on the flagstones, close enough to smell the fear on him, and said, "God give you life, gentle king." Charles, committed to the bit, tried to deny it. He gestured to the decoy and said, "I am not the king, Johanna. There is the king." It was a weak protest, the sound of a man trying to talk his way out of destiny. Joan simply shook her head. "In the name of God, it is you and no other," she replied. The room erupted in whispers. The prank had failed, or rather, it had succeeded in a way no one expected. Charles, shaken and intrigued, pulled her aside. They retreated to a window embrasure, or a quiet corner, away from the straining ears of the court. What happened next is one of the great silences of history. They spoke for a long time. The courtiers watched the body language of their prince shift. He had begun the conversation hunched and defensive, but as Joan spoke to him, he straightened. His face, usually a mask of gloomy resignation, began to brighten. It was said that he looked as if he had been filled with the Holy Spirit. What did she say to him? This is the secret that historians have chased for 6 centuries. Joan refused to reveal it at her trial, saying it was for the king's ears alone. However, the prevailing theory, supported by later testimonies and the specific anxieties of Charles's life, is that she gave him a sign regarding his legitimacy. Remember, Charles was tormented by the rumour that he was a bastard, the product of his mother's affairs, and therefore not the true heir of France. It is believed that Joan revealed to him a private prayer he had made to God, alone in his oratory, asking that if he were the true heir, God would help him, and if not, that he might die or escape to Scotland or Spain. By repeating his secret prayer back to him, or by assuring him that you are the true heir of France and son of the king, she didn't just offer him a crown, she offered him his identity. She healed the wound his mother had inflicted. She gave him permission to be king. When Charles returned to the centre of the room, he was beaming. He declared that he had complete confidence in the girl. The atmosphere in the hall shifted from mockery to a stunned, electric belief. If the king believed, then the court had to believe, or at least pretend to, which is effectively the same thing in politics. But a king's belief is not enough in a world governed by the church. The medieval world was not irrational, it was hyper-rational within its own framework. They believed in miracles, yes, but they also believed in the devil. And the devil, as every theologian knew, was a master of disguise. He could look like an angel. He could look like a pious girl. He could tell you exactly what you wanted to hear to lead you to ruin. The fact that Joan knew the king's secret could be proof of God, or it could be proof of demonic clairvoyance. The church could not risk backing a sorceress. It would be a propaganda disaster. If Charles regained his crown with the help of a witch, his kingship would be cursed. So, the joy at Chinon was short-lived. The machinery of bureaucracy began to grind. Charles, ever the cautious man, decided that instinct was good, but a background check was better. He ordered Joan to be sent to the University of Poitiers, the acting capital of intellect and theology in the exiled kingdom. She would be examined by the most learned men in France. They would probe her faith, her morals, and her virginity. Joan was frustrated. She had ridden through enemy lines. She had identified the king. She had revealed the sign. "I have not come to Poitiers to make signs," she would later snap, with the impatience of a CEO dealing with middle management. "Take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I was sent." But the king insisted. The girl who had terrified the darkness of the road must now face the terror of the lecture hall. The torches of Chinon flickered out, and the cold light of inquiry began to dawn. The road from Chinon to Poitiers is not long, but for Joan it was a journey from the fire into the ice. She had left the warm, emotional vindication of the king's private chamber and walked straight into the cold, dry air of academic scrutiny. Poitiers, in 1429, was the temporary capital of the exiled French legal and religious establishment. It was a city of refugees in robes, filled with bishops without dioceses and professors without classrooms, all of them anxious to prove that they were the guardians of orthodoxy. Joan was brought here not to be celebrated, but to be dismantled. She was lodged in the house of Jean Rabateau, the King's Advocate General, a place of serious books and quiet corners. Here, the process began. It lasted for weeks. Imagine the scene. A great hall filled with the scratching of quills on parchment, the rustle of heavy wool robes, and the low murmur of Latin. Sitting on a simple wooden bench in the centre of this intimidation was the girl from Domremy. She was illiterate, uneducated, and alone. Facing her were the heavyweights of medieval thought, Dominican friars, Carmelite monks, professors of theology, men who had spent their entire lives mastering the intricate architecture of logic and canon law. They were armed with the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. She was armed with nothing but her memory of a voice in a garden, The atmosphere was not hostile so much as it was suffocatingly heavy. These men were not villains. They were bureaucrats of the soul. They were terrified of making a mistake. If they approved a heretic, they damned the king. If they rejected a saint, they damned France. So they picked at her story like weavers looking for a loose thread in a tapestry. They asked her about her childhood. They asked her about the voices. They asked why she wore men's clothes, a point of endless fascination and horror for them. They tried to trap her in theological paradoxes, the kind of logic puzzles that students spent years learning to solve. But Joan did not play by their rules. She cut through the knots of their logic with a blade of common sense that left them blinking in surprise. There is a moment of delightful human warmth recorded in these proceedings, a flash of wit that reminds us Joan was not just a grim fanatic, but a teenager with a sharp mind. One of the examiners was a friar named Brother Séguin de Séguin, a man from the Limousin region known for its thick, difficult accent. He asked her, perhaps with a touch of condescension, "What language do your voices speak?" Joan looked at him, listened to his heavy, stumbling dialect, and replied instantly, "A better one than yours." The room likely erupted in a collective gasp, followed by the suppression of chuckles. Even the solemn doctors of theology could appreciate the irony. It was a small victory, but it shifted the dynamic. She was not a victim here. She was a participant. But the questions grew sharper. One doctor, a man named Guillaume Amery, posed the central dilemma. "You ask for soldiers," he said essentially, "but you say it is God's will that the English leave France. If it is God's will, why does he need soldiers? Can he not just wish them away?" It was a perfect trap. If she said she needed soldiers, she doubted God's power. If she said she didn't, she was useless to the war effort. Joan's answer was a masterpiece of theology that has echoed down the centuries. "The soldiers will fight," she said, "and God will give the victory. Acti labores et Deus dabat incrementum." In one sentence, she reconciled human agency with divine providence. We must do the work, she was saying, but the result belongs to heaven. It was an answer so orthodox, so perfectly balanced, that the theologians had nothing to write down in their columns of heresy. However, the examination was not just intellectual. The medieval mind believed that the soul was reflected in the body, and that a pact with the devil would leave a physical mark. Furthermore, her claim to be la pucelle, the maid or the virgin, was central to her identity. In a time when women were often viewed through the lens of Eve's sin, a virgin was seen as a vessel of purity, untouchable by the devil. So, Joan had to endure a physical examination. She was taken to a private chamber and examined by a jury of matrons, led by Queen Yolande of Aragon, the king's formidable mother-in-law. Queen Yolande was the iron backbone of the Valois court, a woman of immense political intelligence. She, too, needed to be sure. The details of this are lost to the privacy of the room, as they should be, but the verdict was public and clear. The matrons emerged and declared her to be exactly what she claimed, a virgin, intact and pure. It was a stamp of approval that carried as much weight as any theological degree. Historians still mourn the loss of the Book of Poitiers, the official transcript of these weeks of questioning. It disappeared sometime in the chaos of history, leaving us only with fragments and memories cited in her later trials. But we know the conclusion. After weeks of probing, the learned men of Poitiers found themselves at a loss. They had looked for the devil, but they had found only a girl of transparent honesty, humility, and a frighteningly clear purpose. They could find nothing in her but good, humility, virginity, devotion, and honesty, but their final report was cautious. They did not declare her a saint. The church does not move that fast. Instead, they offered a pragmatic, beautifully hedged bet. They advised the king that, given the desperate situation of Orléans, and seeing no evil in her, he could make use of her. It was a presumption of innocence combined with a military gamble. They were essentially saying, we cannot prove she is from God, but we cannot prove she isn't. Send her to Orléans. If she wins, it's a miracle. If she dies or fails, well, we haven't lost much. It was a cynical calculation wrapped in holy language, but for Joan, it was the green light. The verdict of Poitiers changed everything. The king formally accepted her service. The waiting was over. The girl who had been asked to explain her theology was now told to prepare her war. And here the transformation began in earnest. She would need more than a traveller's tunic now. She needed the shell of a warrior. The court moved to the city of Tours to prepare her equipage. This was not just about handing her a sword, it was about branding a legend. The king, now invested in the gamble, spared no expense. He commissioned a suit of armour to be made specifically for her. This was a significant engineering challenge. Plate armour in the 15th century was custom-tailored, usually for broad-shouldered men. The armourers of Tours had to forge a suit of white armour, unadorned, polished steel, that would fit the frame of a teenage girl. It had to be light enough for her to mount a horse unassisted, which she did, vaulting into the saddle with a grace that always surprised the soldiers, yet strong enough to stop an English arrow. Imagine the sound in the forge, the hammer ringing on white-hot steel, shaping the greaves and the breastplate that would protect the daughter of God. C'est rapide, but Joan had her own requirements and they were specific. When the king offered her a sword, perhaps a royal blade, she refused. The voices had spoken again. She told the king that there was a sword buried in the ground behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, a place she had passed on her way to Chinon. She had never been inside the church, yet she described the location perfectly. She said the sword would be found covered in rust, marked with 5 crosses. The king sent an armourer to the church. The priests were baffled. They knew of no such weapon. They dug where she directed. Behind the altar, there deep in the earth, they struck iron. They pulled up an ancient rusted sword. When they wiped it, the rust fell away easily, a small miracle in itself, revealing the 5 crosses on the blade. The discovery of the sword of Fierbois sent a shiver through the army. It was a physical token of her mystical knowledge. It was an Arthurian moment, the sword from the stone, the weapon provided by Providence. She did not polish it or sharpen it for blood. She simply strapped it to her waist. Yet for all the steel, Joan's most important weapon was made of cloth. She designed her own banner, dictating the imagery to a Scottish painter named Hauve Pour Noir, a delightful French mangling of Hamish power. It was a large standard of white linen, fringed with silk. On it, she ordered the image of God holding the world, flanked by 2 angels with the words, Jesus Maria stitched in gold. She loved this banner, she said later, 40 times more than her sword. Why? Because the sword was for killing, but the banner was for leading. The sword was the reality of war. The banner was the ideal. She would carry it into the thickest fighting, not to strike men down, but to guide them, a white sail in a sea of blood. By April 1429, the preparations were complete. The girl from the garden was gone. In her place sat a knight in white steel, her hair cut short, a mysterious sword at her hip, and a banner snapping in the wind above her head. She rode out of Tours, not alone this time, but at the head of a supply convoy, surrounded by captains who looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. The destination was Orléans. The city was dying, the English were waiting, and the time for questions was over. The army that gathered at Blois in late April 1429 was unlike any military force France had ever seen. Usually, A medieval army was a travelling carnival of vice, a chaotic mass of mercenaries, gamblers, looters, and camp followers, trailing a wake of stolen chickens and broken casks. But when Joan arrived, she did not just bring a sword, she brought a scouring brush to the soul of the soldiery. She declared that this was a holy mission, and therefore the men who fought it must be clean. She ordered the prostitutes and camp followers to be sent away. She banned looting. Most shockingly, she banned swearing. For the veteran mercenaries whose vocabulary consisted almost entirely of blasphemy, this was a harder challenge than storming a wall. It is said that she allowed one crusty commander, Lahir, a man who was essentially a walking callous, to swear by his baton simply because he couldn't form a sentence without a curse. The atmosphere in the camp shifted. Priests moved among the tents, hearing confessions by the hundreds. Men who hadn't knelt in prayer since childhood suddenly found themselves gathered around the banner of the maiden, singing hymns under the spring stars. It was surreal. It was a pilgrimage, armed with pikes. Historians still argue whether this moral cleansing had any tactical value, but psychology suggests it was brilliant. By convincing these defeated men that they were now soldiers of God, she gave them back their dignity. A man who believes in it he is damned fights with desperation. A man who believes he is saved fights with invincibility. On April 27th, the army marched out of Blois. They moved toward Orléans, 35 miles to the east. The city was surrounded by English forts, a ring of iron strangling the life out of the defenders. The English commanders, Talbot, Glassdale, Scales, were legendary figures of fear. To break the siege, Joan had to get supplies and reinforcements into the city. But here, the first friction between the mystic and the military occurred. The French captain, seasoned and cautious, did not trust Joan's plan to march straight through the English lines on the north bank of the Loire. It was too dangerous, they reasoned, so they deceived her. They led the army along the south bank, through the Sologne region, placing the wide river between them and the main English garrisons. When Joan realized what they had done, that they had avoided the enemy she wanted to smash, she was furious. She was not a mascot, she was a commander, and she hated being handled. They arrived at the south bank of the Loire, across from Orléans, on April 29th. The view was daunting. Across the wide grey water lay the city, its spires rising behind battered walls. Between the French army and the city gate lay the river, and the river was the problem. The French boats needed to transport the supplies were moored in the city, but the wind was blowing strongly from the east, blowing downstream. The heavy barges could not sail against the current and the wind to reach Joan's position. The convoy was stuck. The captains looked at the sky and shrugged. This was the reality of sailing. You cannot fight the wind. It was here that Joan met Jean de Dunois, known to history as the bastard of Orléans. He was the illegitimate half-brother of the captive Duke of Orléans and the man who had held the city together through months of starvation and bombardment. He was a brilliant soldier, pragmatic and exhausted. He crossed the river to meet this maid he had heard so much about. The meeting was sharp. Joan, still stinging from the deception about the route, looked at him and asked, "Are you the bastard of Orléans?" "I am," he replied, with the easy confidence of a man who owned his title. "And I am glad of it. Was it you who advised that I should come here on this side of the river and not go straight to where Talbot and the English are?" Dunois, diplomatic but firm, explained that it was the safer, wiser choice. Joan's reply was a thunderclap of faith. "In God's name," she said, "the counsel of God is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, but you have deceived yourself." And then it happened. It is one of those moments where history holds its breath. as they stood on the river bank, the flags snapping in the stiff easterly breeze. The wind suddenly died. The water smoothed out, and then the pennants fluttered and snapped in the opposite direction. The wind had shifted. It was now blowing from the west, perfect for driving the barges upstream against the current. Dunois, a man of engineering and ballistics, stared at the sails. He knew the weather patterns of the Loire Valley. A shift like this, at this exact moment, was improbable to the point of impossibility. He later testified at her rehabilitation trial that this was the moment he believed. The barges cast off, their sails catching the new wind, and glided effortlessly up the river to where Joan and the supplies waited. The miracle of the wind broke the logistical deadlock. The supplies, grain, cattle, pigs, were loaded, and the convoy slipped past the English forts, who watched in paralysed silence, perhaps sensing that the rules of the game had just changed. That evening, Joan prepared to enter the city. She would not hide. She would enter at night to avoid the crush of the desperate crowds, but she would enter as a saviour. She crossed the river and mounted a white horse. At 8 p.m. on April 29th, 1429, the gates of Orléans opened. The scene was apocalyptic in its intensity. The city had been under siege for half a year. The people were starving, terrified, and living in the shadow of constant bombardment. When Joan rode through the Burgundy Gate, the city erupted. Torches flared in the narrow streets, casting wild dancing shadows on the stone walls. Men, women, and children poured out of their houses, weeping, cheering, reaching out to touch her boots, her stirrups, the flank of her horse. It was not a military parade. It was a religious ecstasy. The chronicle of the siege describes the scene. They felt they had been despoiled and lost, but now saw the siege raised by the divine power. Joan rode through the crushing press of bodies, her white armour glowing in the torchlight, her banner held high. She smiled at them, speaking gently, telling them to trust in God. There was no arrogance in her, only a profound, calm reassurance. At one point, the crowd was so thick that a torchbearer was pushed too close to her standard, and the linen caught fire. The crowd gasped, a bad omen. But Joan, with the reflexes of a farmer's daughter who had put out many hearth fires, spurred her horse, leaned down, and extinguished the flame with her hand, all while keeping her mount steady. The crowd roared its approval. She could handle fire too. She did not go to the castle to sleep in royal luxury. Instead, she chose the house of Jacques Boucher, the treasurer of the Duke of Orléans, a respected citizen. She wanted to be among the people, not above them. She shared a bed with the treasurer's wife and daughter, a common practice in the Middle Ages, but also a sign of her desire for simple domestic comfort after the long march. That night, the noise of the celebration finally faded. The torches burned down to embers. Joan lay in the strange bed, the smell of the river and the city stone in the air. Outside the walls, in the dark encircling forts, the English soldiers sat by their fires, listening to the impossible sound of joy coming from the city they were supposed to be crushing. They knew the witch had arrived. The psychological balance of the war had tipped. The girl was inside the walls. Inside the house, Joan closed her eyes. She was tired. She had ridden hundreds of miles, faced down theologians, reorganized an army, and broken a blockade. But as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that the hardest part was not behind her. The wind had brought her here, and the people had cheered her arrival. But cheers do not knock down stone towers. The English were still there. The siege was not broken. It was only challenged. Tomorrow the banner would have to be lowered, and the sword would have to be drawn. The lullaby of the river was soothing, but the dawn would bring the roar of the cannons. The morning sun over Orléans on April 30th, 1429, did not rise upon a city at peace, but upon a cage of stone and fear. The celebration of the previous night had faded into the cold reality of daylight, revealing the true shape of the blockade that strangled the city. To the south, blocking the bridge, across the Loire, stood the Tourelles, a massive stone fortress complex bristling with English cannons. Around the city's perimeter lay a ring of earthen and timber forts, known as bastilles, each one a watchful eye that never blinked. That the English army, led by the Earl of Suffolk and the fearsome William Glasdale, sat in these forts like wolves waiting for a wounded deer to finally collapse. They had been there for months. They were bored, they were cold, and they were utterly confident that starvation would do their work for them. But the air in the city had changed. The arrival of the maid had introduced a new element to the siege: noise. Not the noise of weeping or bombardment, but the noise of defiance. Joan did not immediately launch a physical attack. Instead, she launched a psychological one. She believed, with a charming and tragic naivety, that the English might simply leave if asked politely in the name of God. She dictated a letter, one of the most famous documents of the war, addressed to the King of England and his generals. "Render to the maid, who is sent here by God, the King of Heaven, the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France," it read. It was an ultimatum delivered with the absolute authority of a divine landlord evicting a bad tenant. She warned them that if they did not leave, she would make a war cry that will be remembered forever. When her heralds delivered this message to the English camp, the response was exactly what you might expect from medieval soldiers who had been conquering France for decades. They laughed. They detained one of her heralds, a breach of diplomatic immunity that infuriated Joan, and sent back messages calling her a cowgirl and a whore of the Armagnacs, threatening to burn her if they ever caught her. The insults stung. Joan was young, and for all her divine confidence, she was sensitive to attacks on her honour. She went to the ramparts of the city, walking out onto the bridge fortifications within shouting distance of the English garrison at the Tourelles. There, a strange, almost intimate scene played out, a shouting match across the river between a teenage girl and the English commander, William Glasdale. He stood on the ramparts of his fort, mocking her, calling her names that would make a sailor blush. She shouted back, her voice carrying over the water, telling him to surrender to save his life, crying out that he would soon die, but not in battle. It was a surreal moment of human connection before the slaughter, a reminder that these armies were close enough to hear each other breathe. While Joan waged her war of words, the French captains, including Dunois, were playing a different game. They were practical men. They knew that morale was high, but they also knew that a direct assault on the English forts was suicide without more troops. Dunois left the city briefly to gather the rest of the army from Blois, leaving Joan to chafe in the idle city. She spent the days riding through the streets, her presence acting as a living banner for the people, but her patience was fraying. She wanted to strike. The voices were urging her to act, while the captains were urging her to wait. It is a tension that historians still analyze, the clash between the intuitive, mystical impulse for immediate action and the slow, calculated logic of military strategy. Usually, in war, the calculated logic wins. But in Orléans, the logic was about to be overruled by a nap. On the afternoon of May 4th, Dunois had returned with the reinforcements, and the city was lulled into a deceptive quiet. Joan, exhausted by the tension, had laid down to rest. Her squire, a young man named Louis de Coute, was in the room, and the house was silent. Suddenly, Joan sat bolt upright in bed. It was not a slow waking. It was a jolt, as if an alarm had rung in her ear. She was agitated, breathless. "In God's name," she cried out, "my counsel has told me I must go against the English, but I do not know where. Or against whom? Her voices were screaming at her that French blood was being spilled, but they hadn't given her the coordinates. She scrambled out of bed, the confusion of sleep replaced by a frantic urgency. "My arms," she shouted. "Give me my arms." It was a chaotic scene. The squire fumbling with the buckles of her armour, the household waking up in alarm. In the rush, they couldn't find her banner. It was eventually passed to her through an upper window by her page, a frantic handoff that underscores the desperate improvisation of the moment. She rushed out of the house, mounted her horse, and galloped toward the sound of distant noise, sparks flying from the cobblestones. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew she was late. As she rode toward the eastern gate, the Burgundy Gate, she encountered the first casualties. Wounded men being carried back into the city. It was the first time she had seen the real cost of her mission close up. She stopped for a moment, looking at the blood, and whispered, "I have never seen French blood spilled, but my hair did not stand on end." It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a reminder that the warrior saint was also a girl who hated suffering. But she did not turn back, she rode on. It turned out that a French captain, eager for glory, had launched an unauthorized attack on the English fort of Saint-Lô, a lonely outpost east of the city. The attack had gone badly. The English were repelling the French, driving them back toward the city walls in a panic. The French retreat was in full swing when the soldiers saw it, the white banner coming out of the city gate, moving against the tide of fleeing men. The effect was instantaneous. The sight of the maid riding toward the danger stopped the retreat cold. Men who had been running for their lives turned around. "The maid! The maid is here!" The cry went up, rippling through the ranks. Joan did not issue complex orders. She simply rode straight at the English fort, her banner snapping in the wind, and the French army followed her like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The English garrison at Saint-Lô, who had been cheering their victory moments before, suddenly saw the flow of battle reverse. The French hit the earthen walls of the fort with a new, terrifying energy. For hours, the battle raged. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting, the air filled with the smoke of gunpowder and the screams of men. Joan stayed in the thick of it, urging them on. A constant point of white light in the grime of war. And then the impossible happened. The fort fell. The French stormed the walls, burning and capturing the stronghold. It was the first French victory in months, perhaps years. The English were killed or captured. The invincible enemy had been broken. But as the sun set over the smoking ruins of Saint-Lô, the lullaby takes a sombre turn. Joan did not celebrate. She did not drink with the captains or boast of her conquest. Instead, she walked among the bodies of the English soldiers. She wept openly. She lamented that these men had died without confession, their souls lost to the darkness. She protected the English prisoners from the vengeful French mob, ensuring they were treated with mercy. In the midst of her first triumph, she was mourning the enemy. It was a confusing, beautiful contradiction that silenced the rough soldiers around her. They had won, yes, but their general was crying for the men they had just killed. The city of Orléans did not sleep that night. Church bells rang out, not in alarm, but in triumph. The ring of steel had been breached. The English were human after all, and in the house of the treasurer, the girl who had terrified the English sat quietly, cleaning the soot from her face, knowing that this was only the beginning. The fort of Saint-Lô was just a finger. The hand that held the throat of the city, the massive fortress of the Tourelle, was still waiting across the river. But the spell of fear was broken. The city breathed. The night air was sweet with the scent of victory, but heavy with the promise of the storm to come. The sun that rose on May 7th, 1429, did not just bring light, it brought a sense of finality, the heavy metallic taste of a day that would decide everything. This was the day of the Tourelle, the massive stone fortress complex guarding the bridge across the Loire was the anchor of the English siege, a monster of masonry sitting in the middle of the river, defying the French to come and take it. If Saint-Lô had been a skirmish, this was the war. Joan was up before dawn, her energy vibrating at a frequency that unsettled the tired captains. She had awoken with a specific, chilling piece of knowledge, one she had shared with her confessor the day before. "Tomorrow," she had said, "blood will flow from my body above the breast." It is one of the most unsettling details of her story. Historians possess the letter written a fortnight earlier, where this prediction was recorded, proving it was not a legend invented after the fact. She knew pain was coming, yet she strapped on her armour with the calm precision of someone dressing for church. The French army, emboldened by their recent victories, crossed the river in boats, landing on the muddy bank in front of the fortress. The assault began early. It was a scene of industrial-scale violence. The French raised scaling ladders against the high stone walls, and the English threw them back down. Arrows rained from the sky like a dark sleet. Stones and boiling oil poured from the machicolations. The noise was deafening. The roar of cannons, the scream of dying horses, the crunch of steel on stone. Joan was everywhere. She was not in the rear issuing orders. She was at the foot of the wall, her banner held high, a beacon of white in a storm of grey and red. She was shouting encouragement, telling the men to have faith, to push harder. And then, around noon, the prophecy found its mark. A bolt from an English crossbow, or perhaps a longbow arrow, the accounts vary, flashed through the chaotic air. It found the chink in her armour, plunging into the space between her neck and her shoulder, driving deep into the muscle. The shock must have been absolute. The maid, the invulnerable messenger of heaven, stumbled. The banner wavered. She was carried from the field, bleeding heavily, the shaft of the arrow protruding from her chest like a grim accusation. The French assault faltered. Seeing their angel fall drained the courage from the soldiers, faster than the blood drained from her wound. The English on the walls cheered, mocking the witch who had finally proven mortal. They believed the battle was won. Behind the lines, in a quiet vineyard away from the smoke, Joan lay on the grass. The pain was excruciating. Medieval surgery was less a science and more a terrifying negotiation with infection, and her doctors, well-meaning but limited men, suggested charming the wound with incantations. Joan, even in her agony, snapped at them. She would rather die than sin by using magic. Instead, she allowed them to dress the wound with olive oil and lard, a salad dressing applied to a puncture wound, which was the state of the art in 1429. She wept. It is important to remember this. She did not stoically endure like a marble statue. She cried like a 17-year-old girl who had just been shot. But then as the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened, something happened in that vineyard. The French commanders, including Dunois, were preparing to sound the retreat. The sun was setting, the men were exhausted, and their talisman was broken. "We will try again tomorrow," they likely said, the universal excuse of the defeated. But Joan heard the trumpets preparing to signal the withdrawal. She sat up. She pushed the doctors away. She put her armour back on. Imagine the physical agony of that act, metal pressing against torn flesh. She mounted her horse and rode back to the front line. The sight of her returning was more powerful than 1,000 fresh knights. The French soldiers, who had been dragging their feet, stopped. They stared. She was back. She was alive. The English on the walls saw her too, and their cheering died in their throats. Was she immortal? Was she a demon? Fear, cold and irrational, gripped the defenders. Joan rode to the edge of the moat. She saw her standard-bearer resting, the banner grounded. She seized the banner herself, or told a soldier to hold it, shouting, "Watch! When the wind blows the banner against the wall, you shall enter." The wind caught the fabric. The white linen touched the stone. "Go in!" she screamed. "All is yours." The French surged forward with a terrifying, renewed violence. They swarmed up the ladders as if gravity had been suspended. The English defence shattered. Panic is a contagious disease, and the English caught it instantly. They abandoned the outer boulevard and tried to flee across the drawbridge to the main tower of the Tourelle. But the bridge was on fire. A barge filled with combustibles had been floated under it by the French. As the English commander, William Glasdale, the man who had insulted her, the man she had warned would die without battle, ran across the burning timbers, the structure gave way. The bridge collapsed with a thunderous crash. Glasdale and his best captains fell into the river, weighed down by their heavy armour. They did not surface. Joan, seeing the man who had hated her drown, did not gloat. She fell to her knees and wept for his soul, a moment of radical empathy that seems almost out of place in the brutality of the siege. By nightfall, the Tourelles had fallen. The English blockade was broken. The bells of Orléans rang out again, but this time the sound was different. It was the deep resonant tone of salvation. The next morning, Sunday, May 8th, the remaining English forces marched out of their other forts. They lined up in battle formation on the plain. A wall of reddened steel. The French army lined up opposite them. It was a tense standoff, thousands of men staring at each other across a field of silence. The French captains looked to Joan. Should they attack? Should they wipe them out? Joan shook her head. "It was Sunday. Do not attack them," she said. "If they are leaving, let them go." She ordered an altar to be set up in the field, and there, in the space between two armies capable of slaughtering each other, a mass was held. The English watched for a moment, then turned their backs and marched away, and not in a rout, but in a retreat that signalled the end of their dominance. The siege of Orléans was over. In just 4 days of fighting, the girl from Domremy had undone 7 months of English strategy. The impossible had become history, and as the dust of the departing army settled on the road to the north, Joan finally allowed herself to rest, her shoulder throbbing, the silence of the river valley returning like a cool hand on a fevered brow. The river Loire flows west through the heart of France, a ribbon of silver winding through a valley so lush it is often called the Garden of Kings. In June 1429, the air in this garden was sweet with the scent of blooming hawthorn and ripening grain, but the mood was electric, with something far more volatile. The relief of Orléans had not just broken a siege, it had broken a psychological dam. For decades, the French had been paralysed by a learned helplessness, convinced that the English were invincible, supernaturally gifted warriors who could not be beaten in open battle. But the girl in the white armour had proven that the English bled, ran, and died, just like anyone else. Now, the question that hung in the warm summer air was simple. What next? Logic, the favourite shield of the fearful, dictated caution. The Dauphin's advisers, men who had spent their careers managing defeats, urged a pause. They wanted to consolidate, to negotiate, perhaps to go home and enjoy the harvest. It was the sensible thing to do. But Joan was not interested in sense. She was interested in coronations. She insisted that they must march immediately to Reims to crown the Dauphin. Reims was deep in enemy territory, a journey of hundreds of miles through hostile lands. To the captains, it sounded like a fever dream. They proposed a compromise. Before marching to Reims, they must sweep the rest of the Loire Valley clean. The English still held key fortified bridges at Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. Leaving them intact would mean leaving a knife at their backs. Joan, impatient but pragmatic, agreed, and so began what historians call the Week of Wonders, a military campaign so swift, so flawless, and so absolute that it reads less like a war and more like a broom sweeping dust from a floor. The army moved first to Jargeau, just east of Orleans. It was June 11th. The heat was rising, the sun glinting off thousands of helmets. The English commander, the Earl of Suffolk, held the town with strong walls and artillery. The French captains, true to form, hesitated. They argued about artillery placement and supply lines. Joan, cutting through the debate with her usual terrifying simplicity, seized her banner and walked to the ditch beneath the walls. "Fear not," she cried to the men. "The hour is ready when it pleases God." The assault was brutal. At one point, Joan was climbing a scaling ladder, leading from the front, as always, when a stone cannonball or a heavy rock was hurled from the ramparts. It struck her helmet with a sickening crack, knocking her backward into the ditch. For a heart-stopping second, the army thought she was dead. But before the dust had even settled, she sprang to her feet, shaking the ringing from her head, and shouted, "Friends, friends, up! God has condemned the English." The French, seeing their seemingly indestructible mascot rise again, swarmed the walls in a frenzy. Jargeau fell. The Earl of Suffolk was captured. The momentum was now a physical force. The French army moved west, rolling down the river valley like a storm cloud. On June 15th, they took the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire. On June 16th, they laid siege to Beaugency. The English garrisons, terrified by the stories of the witch who could not be killed, began to crumble. They surrendered, they fled, they dissolved. But the climax of this storm was waiting in the woods near a village called Patay. It was June 18th, 1429. The main English army, led by the legendary Sir John Fastolf and John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was retreating toward Paris, trying to link up with reinforcements. The French were chasing them. This was a reversal of the natural order of the 100 Years' War. Usually, the French blundered into English traps. This time, the French were the hunters. However, the French did not know exactly where the English were. The country was covered in dense forests and scrub, hiding the movements of thousands of men. And here, history offers us a detail so whimsical, it feels like a fable. As the French vanguard rode through the silent woods, straining their eyes for the glint of enemy armour, a stag, a wild deer, startled from the brush. It bolted through the trees, crashing straight into the hidden English positions. The English soldiers, bored and perhaps reacting on instinct, gave a shout, "A hello!" as the deer ran past. That shout changed the history of Europe. The French scouts heard it. They pinpointed the English location. The element of surprise, the lethal weapon of the English longbowmen, was lost. The Battle of Patay is often called the Reverse Agincourt. At Agincourt, the English archers had time to plant their sharp wooden stakes in the ground, creating a fortress of thorns that decimated the French cavalry. At Patay, thanks to the stag and the speed of Joan's vanguard, they had no time. The French cavalry, led by La Hire and Poton de Saintrailles, burst out of the woods and thundered into the English lines before the archers could even string their bows. It was not a battle, it was a rout. The feared English longbowmen were cut down where they stood. The English commanders were swept away. John Talbot, the English Achilles, the man whose name alone could empty a French village, was captured. Sir John Fastolf fled the field, an act that would unfairly tarnish his reputation forever and arguably inspire Shakespeare's Falstaff. In the span of an hour, the military backbone of the English occupation was snapped. Joan arrived, just as the slaughter was ending. Once again, she did not rejoice. She found the field littered with the dead and dying. The the grass stained red in the summer twilight, she found an English prisoner who had been struck on the head, and she sat with him, holding his head in her lap, comforting him as he died, weeping for the waste of it all. It is a recurring theme in this lullaby. The woman who made war possible found the reality of it unbearable. The week of wonders was over. The Loire was French again. The road to Rheims, the road to the crown lay wide open, paved with a victory so complete that even the most cynical advisers could no longer argue against it. The voices in the garden had been right. The impossible was happening, 1 mile at a time. The heat of the day began to fade, the crickets began to sing in the blood-soaked fields of Patay, and the girl in white turned her horse toward the northeast, toward the city of kings, where a crown was waiting in the shadows. The dust of the battlefield at Patay had barely settled when the real war began, not the war against the English, but the war against the Dauphin's caution. The army gathered at Gien, a town on the banks of the Loire, in late June 1429. The heat was becoming oppressive, a thick, humid blanket that made armour unbearable and tempers short. The French court was flush with victory, but it was also paralysed by the paradox of choice. They had just destroyed the English field army. Logic, that persistent, nagging courtier, suggested they should press the advantage in the south, secure the Normandy borders, or perhaps retake Paris while the enemy was reeling. But Joan stood in the centre of the council, a small figure in a room of large egos, and pointed a mailed finger to the northeast. To Rheims, to understand why this was terrifying, you have to look at the map. Rheims, the city where French kings were traditionally anointed with holy oil, was deep inside Burgundian territory. To get there, the Dauphin and his army would have to march over 150 miles through lands controlled by enemies who had sworn to kill them. It was not a march. It was an invasion of a hostile state, without a supply line, without heavy artillery, and without a retreat plan. It was, by every military standard of the day, suicidal. The advisers whispered that it was madness. They said the cities of Troyes, Chalons, and Reims were heavily fortified and loyal to the English cause. They would close their gates, the army would starve in the fields, or be crushed against the walls. But Joan was operating on a different frequency. She understood something the generals missed. Legitimacy is a weapon more powerful than a cannon. In the medieval mind, a king was not truly a king until he was anointed by God in the cathedral of Reims. Charles could win 100 battles, but without that oil on his forehead, he would always be the Dauphin, the pretender, the king of Bourges. To become the king of France, he had to go to the source. "We must go to Reims," she insisted, her voice cutting through the layers of strategic murmuring. "The angel has promised it." After days of hesitation, Charles finally, reluctantly, agreed. On June 29, 1429, the army of the coronation marched out of Gien. It was a strange procession. There were 12,000 men, knights in shining armour, archers in leather brigandines, and priests carrying crosses, all moving under the blaze of the July sun. But there were no siege engines. There were no supply wagons filled with months of food. They were marching on faith, hoping that the walls of Jericho would fall simply because they showed up. The journey began in silence. They moved into the Champagne lands, the earth dry and cracking under their boots. The first few towns they encountered were small, and they opened their gates out of fear or apathy. But the real test lay ahead. The city of Troyes. Troyes was a major capital, garrisoned by Burgundian and English troops. It was the very city where the shameful treaty disinheriting Charles had been signed. It was a fortress of hostility. When the French army arrived on July 5th, the gates were shut tight. The ramparts bristled with spears. The citizens of Troyes had no intention of surrendering to the witch and her bastard prince. They sent a friar, Brother Richard, out to meet Joan, not to negotiate, but to exorcise her. The friar approached her warily, sprinkling holy water in front of him, making the sign of the cross, expecting her to shriek or melt if she were a demon. Joan, watching this performance from her horse, laughed softly, a rare moment of levity in the tension. "Come on," she said, smiling. "I will not fly away." Brother Richard was charmed, but the city council was not. They refused to open the gates. The French army sat outside the walls for days. The heat grew worse. The food ran out. The soldiers began to eat raw beans from the fields. The spectre of disaster, which the advisors had predicted, was suddenly very real. Charles called a council of war. The mood was grim. The Archbishop of Reims argued for retreat. The advisors nodded. The gamble had failed. They should go back to the Loire before they all starved. Just as they were about to sign the order to retreat, Joan knocked on the door of the council chamber. She walked in, looking at the tired, frightened men. She went straight to the Dauphin. "Gentle king," she said, "do not hold more councils. If you will remain here, in 2 days I will deliver the city of Troyes to you." The archbishop looked at her skeptically. "Joan," he said, "if we could have it in 6 days, we would wait." "But can you really do it?" "I will not doubt it," she replied. She left the tent and went to the camp. What happened next was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Joan did not have siege engines, so she decided to act as if she did. She ordered the soldiers to gather bundles of wood, faggots, doors, tables, anything that could be used to fill the moat. She lined up the few small cannons they had. She organized the army into assault columns, shouting orders, pointing at the walls, creating a spectacle of overwhelming, imminent violence. She spent the night preparing, her voice ringing out in the darkness. To the assault! Inside the walls of Troyes, the citizens were watching. They saw the preparations. They saw the witch who had broken Orléans and Jargeau preparing to unleash hell upon them. They knew the stories, that she commanded fire, that she could not be killed. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced their defiance. They did not know that the French were starving. They only saw that the French were terrifying. The next morning, before a single arrow was fired, the gates of Troy groaned open. The city council, terrified by the mere threat of her assault, surrendered. It was a bluff of historic proportions, won by the sheer projection of will. On July 10th, Charles rode into Troyes, not as a conqueror, but as a king in waiting. The army was fed. The momentum, which had almost died in the bean fields, was suddenly unstoppable. The road to Reims was now open. The next major city, Chalons, did not even try to resist. They sent the keys to Charles before he arrived. The fear had turned into something else, a sense of inevitability. The countryside, which had been hostile a month ago, was now lining the roads to see them pass. Peasants held up their children to see the Maid. Old men wept. The impossible march had become a victory parade. As they drew closer to Reims, the landscape became familiar to the king, though he had not seen it in years. And for Joan, the air began to feel heavy with the weight of the prophecy. She was riding beside the king, her banner in hand, but she was also riding toward the culmination of her life's work. There is a story that near Chalons, she met some peasants from her own village of Domremy who had travelled to see her. They asked her if she was afraid of anything. "I fear nothing," she replied, "except treason." It was a haunting note of foresight in the middle of the triumph. She knew perhaps that the enemy in front of her was less dangerous than the envy behind her. On Saturday, July 16th, 1429, the towers of Reims Cathedral rose from the horizon, sharp and grey against the summer sky. The city, like the others, opened its gates. The Archbishop of Reims, who had fled the city earlier, returned to welcome his king. The army entered the city in a state of dreamlike disbelief. They had marched deep into the heart of the enemy, and not a single sword had been drawn against them since Troy's. The suicidal campaign had been a bloodless walk. The Dauphin, who had started the journey trembling at Gien, rode through the streets of Reims with his head high. The people shouted "Noel," the traditional cry of joy for the French king. That night, the city of Reims did not sleep. The cathedral was prepared. The regalia was polished. The holy oil, the Saint Ampoule, which legend said had been brought by a dove for the baptism of Clovis 1,000 years earlier, was readied. Joan was lodged in an inn near the cathedral, but she likely did not rest. She was standing on the threshold of the miracle. The voices in the garden had told her to take the king to Reims. She had done it. She had dragged him through the doubts of his council, through the mud of the Loire, and through the terror of the enemy, and placed him at the foot of the altar. The night air was cool, but the stone of the cathedral was warm, holding the heat of the day. Inside, the shadows were deep, waiting for the light of the coronation to chase them away. The march was over. The crowning was about to begin. The morning of Sunday, July 17th, 1429, dawned with a brilliance that seemed to conspire with history. The city of Reims, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, was awake long before the bells began to ring. The streets were packed with a sea of people, citizens, soldiers, peasants from the countryside, all pushing toward the great stone ship of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Inside, the light filtered through the stained glass, painting the flagstones in pools of ruby, sapphire, and gold. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of centuries, old incense, beeswax, and damp limestone. It was here, in this vast, echoing space, that the frantic, impossible journey of the shepherd girl and the disinherited prince would reach its zenith. The coronation of a French king was usually a meticulously planned affair, prepared months in advance, with the precision of a theatrical masterpiece. But this coronation was improvised. It was a ceremony of urgency. There was no time to commission new robes of state. The king likely wore vestments borrowed from the cathedral treasury or hastily altered finery. The crown of Charlemagne, the traditional crown of France, was locked away in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, deep in English-held territory. It could not be retrieved. So, a crown was found in the cathedral's own collection, perhaps less ancient, but no less golden in the light of the candles. The ceremony began at 9 o'clock in the morning. The organ thundered, shaking the dust from the high-vaulted arches. Charles entered, not as the trembling doubter of Chinon, but as a man walking toward his resurrection. He was surrounded by the peers of the realm, though painfully many of the traditional peers were absent, fighting on the other side, or unwilling to risk the journey. In their place, new men stood, men who had earned their places with blood and loyalty, rather than just bloodlines. But the eyes of the crowd were drawn to the figure standing near the altar. Joan of Arc stood apart, a statue of steel in a sea of velvet. She was fully armoured, her helmet removed, her short hair framing a face that was likely pale with emotion. In her hand she held her banner, the white standard with the image of God and the angels. It was a breach of protocol. Usually, only the peers of the realm held banners in the sacred space. When later asked at her trial why her banner was given such a place of honour when others were not, she replied with a line that cuts through history like a diamond. It had shared in the pain. It was only right that it should share in the honour. The climax of the ritual was the anointing. This was the moment that mattered. In the medieval French tradition, the king was not just a political ruler. He was a sacred figure, a Christ on earth. The oil used for the anointing was not ordinary olive oil. It was the holy chrism from the Saint-Ampoule, a small glass vial that legend said had been brought down from heaven by a dove for the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of France, nearly 1,000 years earlier. The vial was kept in the Abbey of Saint-Remy and was brought to the cathedral under heavy guard. 4 knights, dressed in full armour and mounted on horses, rode into the cathedral itself, their hooves clattering on the stone floor, escorting the abbot who carried the precious flask. The Archbishop of Reims, Regnault de Chartres, took a tiny drop of the solidified celestial oil, it was said to never decrease, and mixed it with the chrism on the paten. He approached Charles. The king knelt. The archbishop anointed him on the head, the chest and the shoulders, sealing him with the holy sign. In that moment, the Dauphin died. The King of Bourges vanished. Charles VII, the divinely appointed King of France, rose in his place. The doubts about his legitimacy were washed away by the oil. God had spoken. The English could crown their infant king in Paris or London, but they did not have the oil of Clovis. They had the power, but Charles had the magic. When the crown was finally placed on his head, the trumpet sounded so loudly that the chroniclers wrote, it seemed the vaults of the church would be rent apart. The crowd outside roared its approval, a sound like the ocean crashing against the cathedral walls. And then, the moment of profound intimacy amidst the spectacle, Joan, who had been standing like a sentinel, moved. She walked to the king, knelt before him, and embraced his knees, weeping hot tears that ran down her armour. "Gentle king," she said, her voice breaking with the sheer release of it all, "now is executed the pleasure of God, who wished that I should raise the siege of Orléans, and that I should bring you to this city of Reims to receive your holy coronation, showing that you are the true king, and the one to whom the kingdom of France belongs." It was the closing of the circle. The voices in the garden had given her a checklist. Save Orléans, crown the king. Check, check. She had done it. In less than 6 months, a teenage peasant had dragged a collapsing kingdom back from the brink of extinction. It was a perfection of narrative that reality rarely allows. In the crowd watching this miracle was a familiar face, a rough bearded farmer from Domremy. Jacques d'Arc, Joan's father, the man who had once threatened to drown her, had travelled to Reims to witness his daughter's triumph. We know he was there because the city records of Reims show a payment to him for his lodging at the L'Âne Rayé, the striped donkey, inn. The city council, recognising him as the father of the maid, paid his bill and gave him a horse to ride home. One can only imagine the conversation between father and daughter in the days after the coronation. Did he apologise? Did he marvel at her armour? Or did he simply look at her with the bewildered pride of a man who realises his child belongs to the world now and not to him? The coronation was the high noon of Joan's life. The sun was directly overhead, casting no shadows. Everything was bright, clear, and triumphant. But the nature of high noon is that it cannot last. The moment the sun reaches its peak, it begins to descend. As the incense cleared and the king stepped out into the sunlight to touch the sick, a traditional power of the French kings, a subtle shift was already occurring. The mission was technically complete. The voices had given her specific tasks and she had fulfilled them. She had not been promised that she would drive the English completely out of France, only that she would crown the king. That evening, as the wine flowed in the streets of Reims and the bonfires burned, Joan felt a strange melancholy. She told the archbishop that she wished she could go back to my father and mother, to keep my sheep and cattle, and do as I was wont to do. It was the plea of a child who realises the game has become too big. She was tired. She wanted to go home, but she was no longer just Jehanne the shepherdess. She was the Maid of Orléans, the mascot of the monarchy. the terror of the English. She was a political asset, a weapon of war. You do not put a sword back in the stone. Once it has been drawn, you use it until it breaks. The king, now anointed and secure, was already listening to new whispers. His advisers, jealous of Joan's influence and weary of her aggression, began to urge diplomacy. The Duke of Burgundy was sending envoys. Perhaps a truce could be signed. Perhaps the war could end with ink instead of blood. Joan wanted to march on Paris. The king wanted to write letters. The unity of purpose that had driven them from the Loire to Reims began to fracture. The miracle phase was over. The politics phase had begun. And Joan, with her absolute blacks and whites, her total reliance on divine command, was ill-equipped for the grey, murky waters of diplomatic compromise. As the king's retinue prepared to leave Reims, Joan rode with them, but the path was no longer clear. The voices were not silent, but their commands were becoming less specific. They promised she would last a year and little more. The clock was ticking. The white banner, which had flown so proudly near the altar, would soon have to face the grime of a different kind of war. A war of sieges without supplies, of attacks without support, of kings who hesitated when they should have struck. The cathedral doors closed behind them, sealing the triumph in the past. Ahead lay the road to Paris, a road paved not with palms, but with cold stones and closed gates. The sun had begun to set, though the sky was still bright with the false promise of an eternal summer. If the road to Reims was an arrow shot straight from a bow, the road from Reims was a leaf caught in a whirlpool. The momentum that had carried the French army across the map for 3 breathless months suddenly hit a wall. Not of stone, but of ink. Charles VII, now crowned and anointed, felt the heavy, comfortable weight of the crown and decided that he preferred it to the weight of a sword. He was tired of war. He was a man who naturally gravitated toward the path of least resistance, and the path of war is all resistance. While Joan was tightening her saddle girths and looking toward Paris, the king was sitting in a tent, reading letters from the Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundians, masters of the diplomatic dance, offered the king a truce. It was a seductive offer, a 15-day cessation of hostilities, with a vague promise that they might surrender Paris peacefully afterward. To Joan, this was madness. It was a trick designed to give the English time to reinforce the capital. "I am not at peace with them," she wrote in a letter to the citizens of Reims, her frustration bleeding through the parchment, "except as regards the lance." She knew that you do not give an enemy like the English a 2-week vacation in the middle of a campaign. But the king, surrounded by advisers who whispered that Joan was becoming too powerful, too dangerous, too loud, signed the truce. The army stalled. They meandered through the Ile-de-France, taking minor towns, moving without the terrible swiftness that had defined the Loire campaign. The summer heat turned into the golden haze of late August. The English used every wasted day to strengthen the walls of Paris and pour troops into the city. The moment of surprise, the shock and awe that had opened the gates of Troyes was gone. Finally, in late August, the truce expired, with no surrender of Paris, exactly as Joan had predicted. The king, shamed, or perhaps pressured, by the captains who still believed in the Maid, allowed the army to move on the capital, but his heart was not in it. He stayed behind at Saint-Denis, the royal necropolis, visiting the tombs of his ancestors, while Joan rode to the gates of the living city. On September 8, 1429, the assault on Paris began. It was the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, a holy day. The pious citizens of Paris were horrified that the saint would attack on such a festival. But Joan, usually so strict about religious observance, was desperate. She knew the window was closing. She stood before the Porte Saint-Honoré, one of the main gates of the city. The walls here were formidable, protected by a double moat, one dry, one filled with water. The fighting was grinding and desperate. There was no miraculous collapse of morale this time. The Parisians had been told that Joan was a monster who would massacre them. So they fought with the fury of survival. The French artillery pounded the walls, but the stone held. Joan, frustrated by the stalemate, did what she always did. She went to the front. She stood on the ridge of earth between the two moats, a perfect target in her white armour. She began to test the depth of the water with her lance, shouting to the defenders to surrender to the King of France. The response was a volley of insults and arrows. "Witch!" they screamed. "Harlot!" And then, for the second time in her life, the steel found her. A bolt from a crossbow, fired by a calm hand on the ramparts, hissed through the air. It did not strike her chest this time. It drove through her thigh. The pain must have been sickening, a deep muscular trauma that buckled her leg. She collapsed onto the muddy bank. But the reaction was different than at Orléans. At Orléans the army had gasped and faltered. Here, under the cynical walls of Paris, the army seemed to sigh. Joan did not leave the field. She lay in the shelter of a donkey-back ridge, bleeding, and continued to shout encouragement to the men. "Go in," she cried. "The place is yours." But the men did not go in. The fire had gone out of them. They were tired. They looked at the sun setting over the impenetrable walls, and they looked at their king, who was miles away at Saint-Denis, and they decided it was over. As night fell, the commanders, including the creeping realization that the king had abandoned them, ordered the retreat. Joan refused to go. She was screaming at them to continue the assault, thrashing against the hands that tried to lift her. In the end, they had to drag her away. It is a heartbreaking image. The saviour of France, wounded and weeping, being forcibly carried away from the battle by her own soldiers, her boots leaving trailing lines in the dust of the defeat. She was put on a horse and ridden back to Saint-Denis, shouting into the darkness that the city could still be taken. The next morning, she was ready to go back. Her leg was stiff and swollen, but her will was intact. She ordered the Duke of Alençon, her loyal friend and fair duke, to sound the trumpets. They would attack from a different side. They would bridge the Seine. But as they prepared to march, a message arrived from the king. It was not a reinforcement. It was an order to stop. King Charles VII forbade any further attack on Paris. He ordered the army to retreat to the Loire, and, in a final act of sabotage that historians still struggle to justify, he ordered the bridge across the Seine at Saint-Denis to be destroyed. The very bridge the army needed to cross back to attack Paris. He literally burned the bridge behind her. The campaign was over. The King of Bourges had decided that he was content with half a kingdom, as long as it was a quiet one. Joan was devastated. She took off her armour, the white suit that had seen the glory of Orléans and the dust of Patay, and placed it on the altar of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. It was a votive offering, a gesture of thanks to God, but it felt like a resignation. She left her sword there, too. Not the Fierbois sword, which she had reportedly broken earlier by swatting a camp follower with the flat of the blade, a flash of temper that showed her fraying patience, but another weapon. The retreat to the Loire was a funeral march for hope. The great army of the coronation, the force that had terrified Europe, was disbanded by the king at Gien on September 21st. The soldiers were sent home. The captains were reassigned. Joan was left without an army, without a mission, and essentially without a purpose. The autumn of 1429 was a season of twilight. The court moved from castle to castle, a travelling circus of luxury and intrigue. Joan was kept around like a trophy, a pet saint. They gave her gifts, a cloak of cloth of gold, a patent of nobility for her family, granting them the name du Lys. They ennobled her, but they would not listen to her. It is the classic fate of the visionary in a bureaucracy. They honoured the symbol while ignoring the person. She spent the winter in a state of restless agitation. She participated in minor skirmishes, small sieges of little consequence, trying to stay useful. But the magic was fading. The voices were still there, but the clarity of the mission, go to Orléans, go to Reims, was gone. Now, she was just fighting a war of attrition. There is a story from this period that captures the shifting mood. A woman named Catherine de La Rochelle came to court, claiming that she too had visions. She said a white lady dressed in cloth of gold appeared to her and told her to ask the king for money. Joan, with her peasant practicality, was suspicious. She spent 2 nights sleeping with Catherine to watch for the vision. Nothing happened. Joan told the king that Catherine was a fraud. It was a moment of professional rivalry between mystics, but it showed that the market for holy women was becoming crowded. The king, however, listened to Catherine as much as he listened to Joan. The uniqueness of the maid was being diluted. By the spring of 1430, the truce with Burgundy had proven to be exactly what Joan said it was, a sham. The Duke of Burgundy was gathering a massive army to crush the remaining French strongholds in the north. The city of Compiègne, a loyal French town north of Paris, was under threat. The king did not order an army to save it, so Joan did what she had done in the beginning. She stopped waiting for permission. In April 1430, without the king's leave, she gathered a small band of mercenaries, Italian crossbowmen, a handful of knights, perhaps 300 or 400 men in total, and rode north. It was not a royal army. It was a private expedition of the faithful. She was riding into the teeth of the Burgundian war machine with a fraction of the force she needed. Her voices had changed their tune. During Easter week, while she was praying in the moat of Milan, they spoke to her not of victory, but of time. "You will be captured before St. John's Day," they whispered. "It must be so. Do not be tormented by it, but accept it with a good heart." Imagine the courage it took to get back on the horse after hearing that, to ride toward a battle you know you will not win, to ride toward a cage. But she rode anyway. She went to Compiègne, slipping into the city at dawn on May 23rd, 1430. She did not know it was the last sunrise she would ever see as a free woman. The gates of Paris had remained closed to her, but the gates of destiny were about to slam shut with a finality that no sword could break. The sun began to dip low over the meadows surrounding Compiègne on the evening of May 23rd, 1430, casting long, bruised shadows across the damp grass. It was a Tuesday, a day that felt ordinary in its rhythm. The birds were singing in the marshes of the Oise River, the cattle were lowing in the distance, and the war was, as always, a distant rumble of thunder on the horizon. Joan had arrived in the city earlier that morning, weary from a night ride, but sleep was a luxury she felt she could not afford. The city was under threat. The Burgundian army was tightening its noose, and the English were moving in to support them. The air inside the walls was thick with the smell of unwashed fear. The citizens looked to her, their eyes wide and desperate, expecting another miracle, another wind to change, another siege to break like glass. But miracles are heavy things to carry. And on this evening, Joan was not planning a grand strategic stroke. She was planning a sortie, a quick, sharp punch to the nose of the enemy. Her plan was simple: ride out across the bridge, strike the Burgundian outpost at Marigny on the far side of the river, create chaos, and retreat before the main enemy force could react. It was a tactic she had used a dozen times before. She put on her armour, and over it she wore a houque, a surcoat of rich cloth of gold and crimson, a garment that marked her clearly on the field. It was not the dress of a covert operative, it was the dress of a banner. She mounted her horse, her standard-bearer unfurled the white flag, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the gates of Compiègne opened. She rode out with about 500 men. They thundered across the long stone bridge that spanned the Oise, the hooves ringing on the cobbles like a drum roll. They swept into the village of Marny, catching the Burgundians by surprise. The skirmish was fierce and fast. French swords flashed in the late light, and the Burgundians scattered. For a moment, it seemed like another easy victory, another story for the chroniclers. But war is a game of inches and seconds. Just as the French were preparing to withdraw, the landscape betrayed them. On a ridge above the village, the English commander, Sir John of Luxembourg, had been out on a casual reconnaissance ride. He saw the flash of the gold surcoat. He saw the white banner. He realized instantly what was happening. He did not panic. He signaled to the English troops stationed in the nearby village of Venette. They did not need to form a complex line. They just needed to sprint. They poured out of Venette, moving to cut off the French retreat to the bridge. Suddenly, the hunters were the hunted. The cry went up among Joan's men. The English are behind us. Panic. That ancient contagion swept through the French ranks. The orderly withdrawal turned into a scramble. Men spurred their horses toward the safety of the bridge, abandoning the fight. Joan, true to her nature, did not run. She stayed in the rear. This is a detail that even her enemies noted with grudging respect. She positioned herself between the fleeing French and the pursuing English, charging back repeatedly to drive the attackers off, buying time for her men to cross the river. She was the shepherd guarding the flock, fighting a rearguard action with a desperate fury. The bottleneck at the bridge was chaos. Hundreds of men were trying to squeeze through the narrow stone archway. The English and Burgundians were pressing hard, hacking at the edges of the crowd. The noise was deafening. Screams, the clash of steel, the splashing of horses driven into the river by the crush. High above, on the ramparts of Compiègne, the city governor, Guillaume de Flavy, watched the disaster unfold. He had a terrible choice to make. The enemy was right on the heels of the retreating French. If they charged across the bridge in the confusion, they would enter the city. Compiègne would fall. He looked at the chaos. He looked at the English knights surging forward, and then he gave the order that has damned him in the eyes of romantics for 6 centuries. Raise the drawbridge, close the gates. The heavy chains rattled. The wooden bridge began to lift, separating the city from the slaughter. The gate slammed shut with a final, hollow boom. Joan was still outside. She was trapped in the meadow, pinned between the river and the wall, surrounded by a swarm of enemies. There was nowhere to go. She was cut off from sanctuary by mere yards. Historians still argue fiercely over Flavy's decision. Was it a military necessity? A cold calculation to save the many by sacrificing the one? Or was it treason, a paid betrayal orchestrated by a court that was tired of her? We will likely never know the contents of Flavy's conscience, but we know the result of his command. The Burgundians swarmed her. They recognized the crimson surcoat. They knew the prize that was within their grasp. They did not want to kill her. A dead peasant is worth nothing, but a live witch is worth a king's ransom. A group of archers and men-at-arms surrounded her horse. One of them, a rough soldier in the service of the bastard of Vendôme, grabbed the gold fabric of her coat and heaved. She was pulled from her saddle. She hit the ground hard. There was no divine intervention. No angel descended with a flaming sword. No lightning struck the archer. There was only the smell of crushed grass, the heavy breathing of men, and the cold reality of capture. She scrambled to her feet, perhaps reaching for her sword, but it was too late. They were on her. "Yield!" they shouted. "Yield to us! Give us your faith!" Joan, dusted with the dirt of the field, looked at them with blazing defiance. "I have given my faith to another than you," she said, "and I will keep my oath to him." She refused to surrender to a man. But physical force does not require consent. She was seized, disarmed, and marched to the tent of John of Luxembourg. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. "We have taken the Maid! We have taken the Maid!" The English and Burgundians cheered until their throats were raw. The terror was over. The witch was in a cage. That evening, the Duke of Burgundy himself, Philip the Good, arrived to see her. He entered the tent where she was being held. We do not know exactly what was said. The accounts are silent on the words, only noting that he stared at her with curiosity. Here was the girl who had humiliated his armies, defeated his allies, and crowned his rival. And she was just a girl, small, dark-haired, dressed in dusty armour, looking back at him with eyes that did not plead. But the most tragic silence of that night did not come from the Burgundian camp. It came from the south. News of Joan's capture reached King Charles VII quickly. The woman who had given him his crown, who had rallied his armies, who had saved his kingdom, was alive and in the hands of the enemy. The code of chivalry was clear on this point. A prisoner of war, especially one of high status, and who had higher status than the saviour of France, could be ransomed. The king could have offered gold. He could have offered a prisoner exchange. He held plenty of high-ranking Burgundian nobles. He could have threatened retaliation. He did nothing. There is no record of Charles VII making a single offer for her release. No letters of protest, no diplomatic missions. He simply let her go. Perhaps he was relieved. She had become a problem. Too loud, too radical, too difficult to control. A martyr is often more convenient for a politician than a living saint. The ingratitude is so profound it leaves a stain on his reign that no amount of gold leaf can cover. While the bonfires were lit in Paris to celebrate her capture, and the Te Deums were sung in London, Joan began her journey into the shadows. She was moved from castle to castle, first to Beaulieu, then to Beaurevoir, kept in high towers, staring out at a world she was no longer allowed to shape. She was not treated cruelly at first. The ladies of the castle of Beaurevoir, the wife and aunt of Joan of Luxembourg, were kind to her. They offered her a woman's dress. She refused. She said the time was not yet. She still clung to the hope, however fading, that she would be rescued. But as the summer turned to autumn, and the leaves began to fall from the trees around her prison tower, the realization set in. No army was coming. No ransom was being raised. The king was silent. The voices in the garden had promised she would save France, but they had never promised and she would survive it. The English wanted her. They were pressuring the Burgundians to sell her. They needed to put her on trial, to prove that her victories were the work of the devil, thereby delegitimizing Charles's coronation. If the king was crowned by a witch, then he was not a true king. It was a simple, brutal equation. And so, the deal was made. The girl who had been worth an army was sold for 10,000 livres tournois, the price of a prince. She was handed over to the English. The battlefield was left behind. The cage of stone and silence was waiting in Rouen, and the fire was already being laid. The river Seine flows through the city of Rouen like a dark artery, carrying the chill of the Atlantic deep into the heart of Normandy. In the winter of 1430, the city was the stronghold of English power in France, a fortress of stone and administration where the occupation had settled into a permanent grinding reality. It was here, on Christmas Eve, that Joan arrived. She did not come as a conqueror this time, but as a piece of property, dragged in chains through the grey streets to the castle of Philip Augustus. The festive bells were ringing for the birth of the Prince of Peace. But for the girl in the iron cage, the season brought only a deepening of the cold. She was placed in a tower facing the fields, but she would not see them. Her world had shrunk from the boundless horizons of the Loire Valley to a cell 6 steps wide. The conditions of her imprisonment were designed to break not just the body, but the mind. By the laws of the Church, a prisoner facing charges of heresy should have been held in an ecclesiastical prison, guarded by nuns or women of good reputation. It was a rule meant to protect the modesty and safety of the accused. But the English, who were paying the bills for this trial, ignored the rule. They threw her into a secular dungeon and placed her under the guard of 5 English soldiers, rough bored men of the house pillar class, who spent their days drinking and their nights mocking her. They were ordered to keep her in irons. A heavy chain was fastened around her waist, connecting to a thick wooden beam, and at night her ankles were shackled to the foot of her bed. It was a brutal physical restraint for a girl who had spent the last year living in the saddle, free as the wind. She lived in constant fear of assault, sleeping in her tunic and hose, lacing the cords tightly, using the men's clothing that so offended her judges as her only shield against the men who guarded her. But the true torture was not the iron, it was the procedure. The trial that began in January 1431 was not a quest for truth. It was a machine built for one purpose: to crush a symbol. The architect of this machine was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais. He was a brilliant, ambitious man, a scholar of the University of Paris who had cast his lot with the English cause. He hated Joan, not necessarily personally, but politically. She represented everything he opposed: disorder, unauthorized mysticism, and the disruption of the hierarchy. If she was from God, then he, a bishop, was wrong. Therefore, she could not be from God. His logic was circular and impenetrable. He assembled a tribunal of nearly 60 assessors, doctors of theology, canon lawyers, abbots, the finest legal minds of the Anglo-Burgundian world. They were the lights of the church, armed with libraries of precedent and the sharp scalpels of scholastic logic. Facing them was an illiterate teenager who didn't know an A from a B, denied a lawyer, denied a witness, and denied even the comfort of Mass. The proceedings opened in the chapel royal of the castle, but often moved to the smaller, more oppressive space of her cell to avoid the crowds. The dynamic was always the same: the wolves circling the lamb, waiting for a slip. They bombarded her with questions, jumping from topic to topic: her childhood, the fairy tree, the voices, the king's secret, her dress, her virginity. They tried to confuse her, to make her contradict herself. When did you last eat? Was St. Michael naked? Do your voices hate the English? They were trying to catch her in a blasphemy, a lie, or a political error, but the miracle of Rouen is that the lamb bit back. Joan's performance at her trial is one of the most astonishing feats of intellect in history. Historians still argue how a girl with no education could navigate the labyrinth of ecclesiastical law with such terrifying precision. She did not just defend herself, she parried. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, the room went silent. It was a lethal trap. If she said yes, she was a heretic, for the Church taught that no one can know for certain if they are in a state of grace. That is for God alone to know. If she said no, she confessed to being a sinner, and her voices were therefore demonic. It was a checkmate move. The assessors leaned forward, quills ready to record her damnation. Joan looked at them and said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The genius of the answer stunned them. It was theologically perfect. It acknowledged God's sovereignty while maintaining her hope. The scribes stopped writing. Cauchon was furious. The trap had snapped shut on empty air. Day after day, The duel continued. They asked about her men's clothes, obsessing over her breeches and tunic. To them her dress was an abomination, a violation of Deuteronomy. To Joan, it was a necessity, both for her work as a soldier and her safety as a prisoner. "I did not wear it by the counsel of any man," she said, "but by the command of God and his angels." When they asked if she would wear a dress to hear Mass, she bargained, like a merchant. "Make me a long dress that touches the ground, without a train, and give it to me to hear Mass, and then I will give it back." She was negotiating for her dignity. They tried to trap her on the nature of the voices. "Does St. Margaret speak English?" they sneered. "Why should she speak English?" Joan shot back, "when she is not on the English side." A flash of the old humour, sharp and dry, cutting through the Latin fog. But the sheer weight of the process began to grind her down. She was sick, likely from food poisoning or the damp conditions of the cell. She was feverish. The interrogations would last for hours, sometimes twice a day. They shouted at her, interrupted her, twisted her words. "You write down what is against me," she complained to the scribe, "but you do not write down what is for me." It was a plea for fairness in a room where fairness had been outlawed. The trial dragged on into the spring. The flowers were blooming in the fields of Normandy, but inside the castle the air was stale with ink and malice. Cochon, frustrated by her resilience, changed tactics. If he could not trap her in logic, he would trap her in fear. On May 9th, she was led from her cell not to the courtroom, but to the torture chamber in the great tower. The instruments were laid out, the rack, the screws, the braziers. The executioners stood ready, their faces hidden, their hands heavy with the tools of pain. Cochon pointed to the metal and the fire. "If you do not tell the truth," he threatened, "you will be put to the torture." Most men would have broken. The mere sight of the rack was usually enough to extract a confession. Joan looked at the instruments, then at the bishop. She was weak, she was sick, and she was alone. But her voice did not tremble. "Truly," she said, "if you were to tear my limbs asunder and drive my soul out of my body, I would tell you nothing else. And if I did say anything, I would always say afterwards that you had made me say it by force." It was a devastating legal argument. She was telling them that torture was useless because any confession obtained by pain was a lie. She was invalidating their methods before they even touched her. Cochon hesitated. He looked at his assessors. They debated. In the end, they decided not to torture her, not out of mercy, but out of fear that she would die under the strain, or that her endurance would be seen as another miracle. The witch, who could not be broken by pain, would become a martyr too soon. They sent her back to her cell. The iron door clanged shut, leaving her in the dark. She had won the battle of the torture chamber, just as she had won the battle of the theology trap. But she was losing the war. The trial was never about guilt or innocence. It was about power, and power does not accept defeat. By late May, the assessors had compiled their 12 articles of accusation. They declared her a schismatic, an invoker of demons, a diviner, and a heretic. The verdict was written before the trial began, but now it was stamped with the seal of the University of Paris. The tragedy was closing in. Joan could feel it. The voices, which had once promised her great victory, now spoke of deliverance, but in a way she could not quite understand. "Accept all willingly," they whispered in the damp silence. "Do not worry about your martyrdom. You will come at last to the kingdom of paradise." Martyrdom, the word hung in the air like smoke. She had thought deliverance meant a rescue party, a sudden raid by Dunois or La Hire. Now, looking at the cold stone walls and the waiting chains, she began to realize that the deliverance might not be a door opening out, but a fire rising up. The The camera of history lingers on her face, in the gloom, pale, eyes wide, with the realization of the price she was about to pay. The girl who had terrified kings was now terrified herself, not of the English army, but of the fire, and the fire was ready. On the morning of Thursday, May 24th, 1431, the heavy iron door of Joan's cell swung open, but not to lead her to the stake, at least not yet. This was to be a day of theatre, a meticulously staged production designed to break her spirit in public before destroying her body. She was led out of the castle, blinking in the bright spring sunlight, and carted to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, a sombre, walled garden of the dead in the centre of Rouen. The space was packed. A restless, murmuring crowd of citizens, soldiers, and priests pressed against the barriers. 2 wooden platforms had been erected, rising above the sea of heads like islands. On one sat the judges, the cardinals, and the bishops, resplendent in their scarlet and purple robes, a wall of grim authority. On the other stood Joan. She looked small and terribly alone. She was 19 years old, weakened by months of imprisonment, feverish, and surrounded by thousands of eyes that viewed her as a curiosity or a monster. A preacher, Guillaume Erard, began a sermon. It was a verbal assault, a long, thundering condemnation of her crimes, her king, and her life. He pointed a finger at her, shouting, "O noble house of France, which was always the protector of the faith, have you been so abused that you have adhered to a heretic and schismatic?" Joan listened, her face pale. When he attacked her king, calling Charles a heretic, she interrupted. Even here, at the edge of the grave, her loyalty flared up. "By my faith, sir," she shouted over the crowd, "with all reverence to you, I dare say and swear, on pain of my life, that he is the most noble Christian of all Christians." The bailiffs shouted her down. Silence was the only role left for her to play. Then came the pivot. The preacher stopped. He offered her a choice. A document was produced, a schedule of abjuration. It was a confession. If she signed it, she would admit that her voices were false, her mission was a lie, and her men's clothes were an abomination. In exchange, she would be saved from the fire. She would be transferred to a church prison, released from the English chains. "Sign it," they urged her. "Do not burn." At the same time, the executioner appeared. He had his cart ready to take her to the burning place if she refused. The psychological pressure was immense. It was the moment every human being fears. The choice between integrity and survival. Joan wavered. She looked at the fire in the executioner's eyes and then at the paper. She was terrified. The bravado of the battlefield is one thing. The cold, slow horror of the stake is another. "I submit to the judgment of the church," she whispered. She could not write. So she made her mark. A circle, or perhaps a cross, a shaky scratch of ink on parchment that signed away her truth. The crowd erupted. The English soldiers were furious, throwing stones and shouting that the judges had been bought. They wanted a burning, not a confession. But the document was signed. Joan was saved. "Now," Joan asked, likely with a desperate hope in her voice, "take me to the church prison, so I may be out of the hands of the English." Bishop Cochon looked at her cold and delivered the punchline of the trap. Take her back to the place from whence she came. There was to be no church prison, no nuns, no release from the irons. She had confessed. She had humiliated herself. She had betrayed her voices. And for what? To be dragged back to the same dark cell, to the same abusive guards, to the same chain? The realization must have been more painful than any torture. She had traded her soul for a life that was not worth living. For 3 days, she sat in the darkness, crushed by the weight of her abjuration. Her voices returned to her. They did not comfort her, they scolded her. They told her she had done a great treason to save her life. She realized that the physical fire was terrifying, but the internal fire of self-betrayal was worse. On Sunday morning, May 28th, the judges received a shocking report. Joan had relapsed. They rushed to her cell. They found her sitting on the edge of her bed, dressed once again in the forbidden men's tunic and hose. Her hair was shaved back. Her face was set in a mask of grim resolution. Why had she done it? Some say the English guards had stolen her dress and forced her into the men's clothes. Others say she did it to protect herself from rape, as the tunic could be lace tight. But Joan, when asked, gave a simpler, more devastating answer. I have taken it again because it is more lawful and convenient for me to wear men's dress, being with men, than to wear a woman's dress. I have done it because the promises made to me were not kept. Then she dropped the final hammer. I did not understand what I was signing. I would rather die than remain in these irons. She revoked her confession. She declared that her voices were real, that they were from God, and that she had lied out of fear. Bishop Cochon left the cell, but he was not angry. He was smiling. He turned to the English gathered in the courtyard and said simply, "Farewell, it is done." A relapsed heretic could not be saved. The church had done its duty. Now, the fire could have its due. The morning of Wednesday, May 30th, 1431, was bright and clear. The execution was set for the Old Market Square, the Place du Vieux Marché. At dawn, a friar, Martin Ladvenu, entered her cell to tell her the time had come. Joan broke down. She wept uncontrollably, tearing at her hair. "Alas!" she cried. "Will they treat me so horribly and cruelly that my body, which has never been corrupted, must today be consumed and turned to ashes? I would rather be beheaded 7 times than burned." It is the most human moment of her life, the raw, unfiltered terror of a 19-year-old girl facing a horrific death. She was not a marble statue. She was flesh and blood, and she was afraid. But by the time the soldiers came to collect her, the tears had stopped. She dressed in a long, white shift soaked in sulphur to make it burn faster, a small, grim mercy. She put on a paper mitre cap, like a dunce cap, on which were written the words, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." She was led out to the cart. The journey to the marketplace was slow. The streets were lined with thousands of people, many of them weeping. Even the English soldiers who had hated her for so long were silent. The atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of a heavy, suffocating tragedy. As she passed, she saw Bishop Cochon watching. She looked at him and said, "Bishop, I die through you." It was a curse and a statement of fact that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They arrived at the Vieux Marché. The stake was terrifyingly high, built on a plaster platform so that the executioner could not reach her to strangle her, a common mercy, to spare the victim the flames. She would feel everything. She climbed the ladder. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by a sudden pity, broke a stick in 2, tied it with string, and handed her a crude wooden cross. She kissed it and put it in her bosom, next to her skin. Then she asked for the crucifix from the nearby church to be held up before her eyes so she could see it until the end. Friar Isambard de la Pierre ran to fetch it. The executioner secured her to the stake. The chains were wrapped around her body. The wood was piled high at the base. The torch was applied. The flame caught. The smoke began to curl upward, grey and acrid. The silence of the crowd was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the dry wood and the sobbing of the spectators. As the heat rose, Joan did not scream curses. She did not beg for mercy. She looked at the cross held high in the smoke. "Jesus!" she cried. Her voice rang out over the square, clear and strong. "Jesus, Jesus. She called on her saints. She insisted one last time that her voices were from God, that she had not been deceived. And then, as the wall of fire engulfed her, sweeping away the white dress, the paper cap, and the body that had saved a kingdom, she screamed the name one last time, Jesus! And then silence. The fire roared, consuming the oxygen, turning the history into ash. The executioner, following a grotesque order to prove she was truly dead and truly a woman, pushed the burning wood back to reveal her charred body to the crowd. A gasp went through the square. She was gone. The fire was built up again to reduce everything to dust. The English were terrified. One soldier, who had sworn to add a faggot to the fire, collapsed crying that he had seen a white dove fly from her mouth. The executioner went to the friars that evening, shaking and weeping, convinced he was damned because he had burned a saint. The ashes of Joan of Arc were scraped up, every bone, every speck of dust, and thrown into the river Seine from the Mathilde Bridge. They wanted no relics, they wanted no grave, they wanted her to disappear, to wash away into the cold Atlantic and be forgotten. But as the grey ash swirled in the dark water, drifting toward the sea, the story did not end. The river carried her away, but it could not wash the stain from the conscience of France. The girl was dead. The legend had just begun. The fire in the old market died down, leaving only a blackened scar on the cobblestones of Rouen, but the heat of that day would take centuries to dissipate. The English commanders and the ambitious bishops believed that by reducing Joan's body to ash and scattering it into the Seine, they had solved the problem. They thought that without a body there could be no shrine. Without a shrine there could be no pilgrimage, and without a pilgrimage the memory of the maid would fade into the fog of folklore, a strange ghost story to frighten children. They were wrong. In their attempt to erase her, they had accidentally distilled her. By removing the mortal woman, the teenager who cried when she was hurt, who argued with her squires, who loved fine clothes, they had left behind only the idea. And ideas are waterproof. They do not drown in the river. The war did not end on May 30th, 1431. It ground on for another 22 years, a slow, bloody dismantling of the English Empire in France. But the momentum had shifted permanently. The English had killed the messenger, but they could not unhear the message. The French soldiers, who had seen a girl walk through fire and steel, now fought with a grim, fatalistic confidence. The political landscape shifted too. In 1435, the Duke of Burgundy, finally weary of his English alliance, and perhaps haunted by the memory of the prisoner he had sold, signed the Treaty of Arras, reconciling with Charles VII. With Burgundy and France united, the English position collapsed. Paris opened its gates to the king in 1436. Rouen, the city of the trial, fell in 1449. King Charles VII, the man Joan had crowned, finally rode into the city where she had been burned. He was no longer the indecisive Dauphin hiding in Chinon. He was Charles the Victorious, a powerful monarch presiding over a resurrected nation. But there was a shadow on his crown. As long as the verdict of 1431 stood, Charles was officially a king who had attained his throne through the sorcery of a condemned heretic. The Inquisition had declared Joan a witch. Therefore, by transitivity, Charles was the beneficiary of the devil. It was a stain on the legitimacy of the Valois dynasty that could not be scrubbed away by military victory alone. He needed a lawyer. And so, in 1450, the machinery of the retrial began to turn. It was a slow bureaucratic process driven by the king's need for vindication and the church's need to correct a monstrous error, but the emotional heart of this legal procedure was not a king, it was a mother. On November 7th, 1455, a dramatic scene unfolded in the Great Hall of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Isabelle Romay, Joan's mother, now an old woman in her 60s, walked slowly into the church. She was supported by her two sons, Joan's brothers. She fell to her knees before the papal commissioners, weeping, and presented a petition demanding justice for her daughter. "I had a daughter," she cried out to the silent hall, "born in lawful wedlock, whom I strengthened with worthiness, but enemies rose up against her and condemned her." It is a moment of piercing humanity, the peasant mother forcing the highest powers of Christendom to look her in the eye and apologize. The investigation that followed was a forensic excavation of the past. Commissioners travelled across France, interviewing everyone who had known her. They went to Domremy and spoke to the men who were once boys dancing with her by the fairy tree. They went to Orléans and spoke to the old soldiers who had followed her into the breach. They spoke to the scribes who had recorded the original trial, men who admitted they had been terrified of the English and forced to alter the records. The testimony was overwhelming. A picture emerged not of a witch, but of a girl of transparent, luminous goodness. Jean de Metz, the knight who had ridden with her from Vaucouleurs, was now an old man, but his memory was sharp. "She spoke to me with such sweetness," and he recalled, "that I could not do otherwise than believe." Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, testified to her impossible military instincts. The clerks of Rouen testified to the corruption of Bishop Cauchon, revealing how he had hidden spies in her cell and manipulated the evidence. Cauchon himself was beyond justice. He had died years earlier, reportedly of heart failure, while being shaved, but his reputation was exhumed and destroyed. On July 7th, 1456, in the Archbishop's palace in Rouen, just a few hundred yards from the marketplace where she had died, the final verdict was read. The court declared the original trial of 1431 void, invalid, worthless, and without effect. They tore up the articles of accusation. They declared Joan of Arc innocent of all charges. A cross was erected in the old market to mark the spot where she died, not as a monument to a heretic, but as a memorial to a martyr. Yet, even after the rehabilitation, history did not know quite what to do with her. For centuries, she remained a figure of contention. The Enlightenment philosophers, like Voltaire, mocked her as a deluded peasant. The Republicans of the French Revolution were suspicious of her royalism, yet they admired her patriotism. She was a mirror in which every generation saw what it wanted to see. But in the 19th century, as the world grew more industrial, cynical, and complex, the image of the girl in white armour began to shine with a new, necessary light. She became a symbol of national resistance, of pure faith against crushing bureaucracy, of the individual against the machine. Finally, in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her, St. Joan of Arc. The girl who had been burned by the Church was now worshipped by it. It is the ultimate irony, and perhaps the ultimate victory. She sits in the pantheon of saints not because she was a perfect theologian, but because she was a perfect human spirit, a burning fusion of will, faith, and action that defied the gravity of her age. Why does she still terrify kings? Why does her story still haunt us in the quiet hours of the night? It is not because she won battles. Battles are won and lost every day. It is because she rewrote the rules of possibility. She was a peasant who commanded princes. She was a girl who led men. She was an illiterate who outsmarted scholars. She was a victim who became a victor. She reminds us that the world is not fixed. The walls of our own Orléans, our fears, our limitations, our cynical resignations, are not made of stone. They are made of paper, and they can be burned away by a single spark of conviction. Joan did not live to see the peace she fought for. She did not live to grow old, to see her nieces and nephews, to sit by the fire and tell stories of the war. She burned bright and fast, like a flare sent up in the night to show the way. But as the river flows past Rouen, carrying the memory of her ashes to the sea, we understand that her life was not a tragedy. It was a completed circle. She came from the silence of the garden. She spoke the word. She was sent to speak, and she returned to the silence. She proved that history does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to the ones who listen to the voices that others ignore. It belongs to the ones who are not afraid to be the only person in the room, or on the battlefield, who believes. The fire consumed her body, but it also illuminated her truth, that even in the darkest century, when the sky is choked with smoke and the ground is soaked in blood, a single heart beating with purpose is enough to change the world. The camera of our story pulls back now, rising up from the marketplace of Rouen, drifting higher and higher. The noise of the trial, the crackle of the flames, the thunder of the cannons, and the shouting of the captains all fade into a distant rhythmic hum. We see the curve of the river Seine winding like a silver ribbon through the green quilt of France. We see the cathedral of Reims, a tiny jewel box in the distance. We see the village of Domremy, quiet and sleeping under the blanket of centuries. The borders have changed, the kings have turned to dust, and the armour has rusted in the museums. But the light remains, the struggle is over. The pain of the arrow, the weight of the chains, the heat of the fire, it is all gone. There is only peace now, a peace as deep and soft as the velvet night that has fallen over the valley. The wind whispers through the leaves of the beech tree in the garden, the same wind that once carried the sound of bells to a listening girl. It tells you that it is safe to rest. It tells you that the story has been told, the duty has been done, and the history is safe in the keeping of the stars. Let your own thoughts drift away like the ashes on the river, carried gently to a vast and silent ocean. The world is turning slowly, steady, and sure. You are part of that slow, ancient rhythm. Close your eyes. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm cloak. There are no more battles to fight tonight. There is only the quiet. There is only the sleep, sweet dreams.